Secretary Science Advisory Board meeting of 2022. Still virtual, but thanks to Dylan Friedenberg and to Louise Hughes for their technical assistance in allowing us to gather in a virtual setting. We appreciate their help, and I appreciate the work of Dr. Franny Nilsson to work with all the folks at both agencies to draft today's agenda and share it with all of you. Thanks so much. We'll have a record of attendance after our first vote, which will be to adopt today's agenda. But I have heard that it's unlikely that we'll be joined today by Drs. Starr and Dorman. Everybody else will find out when we take attendance later. Before we jump into the first agenda item, which is to approve the agenda, it's my privilege to call upon Department of Environmental Quality Secretary Elizabeth Beiser, who has some remarks for the board and those listening in today. I've had the honor of meeting with Secretary Beiser late last year and was able to share some of the advisory board's successes and challenges over the past few years. She's experienced. In our meeting, she was engaged and engaging. And I think that she's going to do very good things for science-guided environmental management. So with that, Secretary Beiser, thanks for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you, Dr. Osberger. It was a pleasure to be able to sit down with you last year, and it's great to see all of you, at least virtually this morning. But I did want to take just a few minutes to say hello and to thank you for your service on this board. I want you to know that the advice and the recommendations that you provide are invaluable to me and to the whole DEQ team. I'm sure you're already familiar with DEQ's mission, which is providing science-based environmental stewardship for the health and prosperity of all North Carolinians. And it's a mission that I believe in, and it's central to every single action we take here at the department. We are a science-based agency, and I'm grateful to have your support in achieving our mission. And the decisions that we make on these issues impact everyday North Carolinians, so it's really important that we get it right. When the scope of the board was expanded in 2017 to include new and emerging contaminants, we all knew it was just the beginning of a very long road. And we're continuing to learn more and expand our work on compounds such as Gen X, 1,4-dioxane, and other Pfas. And I don't need to tell you that North Carolina is at the forefront of dealing with these major environmental challenges. We were really proud when Administrator Regan unveiled the Pfas roadmap right here in North Carolina, because he has firsthand knowledge of the impact of these harmful chemicals from his time as Secretary. And I am so glad to have that kind of federal support to complement and strengthen our work here from EPA. I'm really proud of the progress we've made so far, and I'm looking forward to our continued work together. Your expertise and service to this board is so vital in helping us guide the state's future strategy. So thank you for letting me have a few minutes this morning, Dr. Osberger. I'm looking forward to hopefully getting to meet all of you in person here at some point if this pandemic will wane a bit, but I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for that orientation to the business of the day. I appreciate it. And we look forward to meeting you in person as well. Hopefully that'll be soon. Okay, with that, I'm going to move us to item number 1, which is to review and approve today's agenda, which has been modified since the one that I sent out. And if Louise or Franny could share that on the screen, I will point out the things that have changed. We still plan on being done by 2 o'clock, but the first change is that lunch has been shortened, our lunch break, to about a half hour. But there's a really good reason. The really good reason is that we've added a presentation in the afternoon. Today is a series of presentations on how the science that the board develops, informs, guides, or consults upon is folded into state rules, regulations, and applications. So we already had presentations teed up for groundwater and surface water protection and for public water supplies, but we've added one for the health guidance for private wells. To accommodate that, as well as make sure that we have adequate time for the public forum, the break is going to be a little bit shorter. So a topic added and break shorter with some times included there, just so folks can see how that might change. The morning was the same, the afternoon's going to change a little bit. So those times are approximate in case that helps. So with that, are there any questions, comments about the draft agenda as modified? Then I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda as modified.
So moved.
Thank you, Rich. Do we have a second?
Second by Jamie.
Also move.
I heard Jamie first, but thank you, whoever else was chiming in. I think it was Elena. Any discussion on the draft agenda? Then I'll call on you one at a time and you can come off mute and vote. I think we're still required to take votes in this fashion in the virtual setting. Dr. Anasia.
Yes.
Thank you. Good morning, Viney.
Good morning.
Dr. DeWitt.
Yes.
Thank you, Jamie. Rich.
Yes.
Thank you, Rich. Elena.
Yes.
Thank you, Gina.
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Knappy.
Yes.
Good morning, Detlef.
Good morning.
David Madden. I hadn't heard that he would be attending, and if you're on mute, you may need to come off mute. Dr. Stoskopf. Betsy.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Tilson and Dr. Vandenberg.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, John. So that is approved, and I appreciate it. With that, we'll move on to the ethics statement, and I believe Louise is going to put that on the screen, and I'll read it, and y'all can follow along.
Dylan. Oh, thank you.
I'm sure I can find it to read it, even if it's not on the screen. All right, I'll read it. In accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it is the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflict. If any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict, with respect to any matters coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. And then if at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. So are there any declarations from board members?
Hi, Tom. This is Jamie. I'd like to share a few items.
Yep, please.
So I'd just like to verify that I received state and federal funding to study the health effects of Pfas. I also serve or have served as a plaintiff's expert witness in cases involving Pfas, and I currently am serving on the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency PFAS Science Advisory Board. Thank you.
Thank you. We're glad to have your expertise on that topic. Anyone else?
This is Detlef, and I also like to declare that I receive federal and state funding to study PFAS primarily in the context of remediation technologies, but also looking at exposure pathways.
Your expertise, along with Jamie's hazard expertise, both valuable on the board. Anyone else? Well, good to have all that out there. There aren't any decisions to make today regarding PFAS, so there should be no conflicts there, real or perceived. Today, largely a chance to learn about how our science gets folded into state rules. With that, I'm going to move us on to the next topic, which is approval of our minutes from the December meeting. And those were distributed by me on January 25th when I sent the draft agenda. And there has only been one change, one substantive change, and that was John Vandenberg recommended that we add a note because the EPA talk was not available as a slide deck. We noted that it was not available, and we said that you could go to the recording to find it. He recommended that we add a parenthetical of when in the recording somebody could go find it so that they wouldn't have to figure that out for themselves. So that change has been made to add the parenthetical of when in the recording you can find it, as well as to clean up some language to that effect. Are there any other comments or suggestions regarding the draft minutes that I distributed on the 25th? Thank you, Louise. If you could scroll down to page 3, people can see that change that I made, or that Franny made. Guess it'll be a little bit higher. It'll be where the EPA talks is, right there. Nope, I think that's an old version. We did change that, and Franny sent one out on Friday. Let's see, I might be able to call it up. Somebody can walk me through how I would share my screen. Is it, well, first, I guess I'll have to ask permission. Then I think I can get it on the screen. Thank you. So I will share my screen. Let me know if folks are able to see a Word document, and if so, I can make it a little bit bigger.
Yes, we can see.
Great. Let me make it a smidge bigger. And then I'll scroll down to the one change that's made. So everything the same that you saw previously. Right here. It's the time during the meeting recording and cleaned up some grammar. So with that, any comments, questions, suggestions about the draft minutes with these modifications from Dr. Vandenberg? All right. Then it would be appropriate for a motion to adopt the minutes from December with these modifications.
Tom, this is John Vandenberg. So moved.
Thank you, John, and thanks for your careful reading. We have a second?
This is Elena, so moved.
Thank you. Any discussion? Great. Well, then the vote is for the motion to adopt the minutes as modified. Dr. Anasia, you may be on mute.
Yes.
Thank you. Jamie,
Yes.
thank you. Rich,
Yes.
thank you. Elena,
Elena, you're muted.
you can raise your hand.
Yes.
Thank you, Elena. Gina,
Yes.
Detlef,
Yes.
thank you. Michael Stoskoff, you've been able to join. Betsy,
Yes, yes, I'm
All
sorry.
right.
Yes.
That's okay, thank you. And John
Yes.
and Davin Madden, if he's been able to join. All right. So those pass. Thank you to Franny and to Louise for the notes, John for the modifications, and Louise, if you can handle posting a final version on the website, that'll be appreciated. We are moving right through the agenda, which is good because it's busy. I think that we're to the point that we can get updates from representatives of the secretaries we serve and their staff. See that we're joined by Assistant Secretary for the Environment, Shushma Masemore. And will you be starting today, Shushma? All right.
Yes,
Thanks
sir.
so much for being here. And thanks for your update. The floor is yours.
Sure. Good morning, board members. I'm going to provide an update on Comores, as well as several other activities going on related to PFAS and a few more updates. As you know, the NCDEQ signed a consent order with Comores and other parties on February 26 in 2019, and an addendum to the consent order on October 12, 2020. At a high level, the consent order addresses source control by continuing to prohibit the discharge of all manufacturing process wastewater from the facility, and it accomplishes the goal requiring dramatic interim reductions in PFAS air emissions, as well as ultimately controlling all PFAS air emissions by 99.99%. I will go over a brief overview of where we are in terms of the implementation of the consent order from the air side. The Division of Air Quality continues to follow up with Comores following their violation of the 12-month rolling sum Gen X emissions violation. Staff will be on site for the upcoming thermal oxidizer scrubber control system stack test during the week of February 7th for all stack tests related to the carbon absorber controls at the site. The DEQ also continues to collect deposition data near field to the Comores facility. The most recent available data is now uploaded on our website. The division continues to collect background deposition data at or near each of our 7 regional offices throughout the state. To date, PFAS is infrequently found in those samples, and if detected, it is usually in the single-digit PPT range. Those data are also posted on our website. I'll move on to our Division of Water Resources update. Related to the NPDES Outfall 003 activities. The Outfall 003 is a feature, is an old effluent channel previously used to discharge processed wastewater from Comores facility prior to the October 2012. It no longer receives processed wastewater, but this feature contains surface water, stormwater, and groundwater, and remains contaminated. The consent order required Comores to implement a treatment system to capture dry weather flow by September 20th, 2020. Based on the implementation of those activities since December 2020, the remediation system has remained in compliance with effluent limits treating flow to 99% removal. Related to the flow-through seeps A, B, C, and D, these seeps have been identified and discharged into the Cape Fear River. These features course down the hill slope bluff face into the Cape Fear River and are contaminated with PFAS that originated from the facility. 4 treatment systems are installed during the late 2020 and early June 2021 period. These treatment systems are pass-through gravity cells containing granular activated carbon. They have demonstrated removal of PFAS parameters of the capture base flow from 89 to greater than 99.9%. Comores is continuing efforts to evaluate and modify their operations and maintenance for these flow-through seeps. I'll move on to the more current activity and that is related to the proposed barrier wall in the groundwater extraction system. DEQ's review of the Comores barrier wall design continues with multiple divisions involved in that review. We are currently responding to additional components of their 60% design report and quality assurance aspects of the wall design. This wall will be approximately 6,000 feet long and 70 feet deep along the Cape Fear River and will cut off groundwater that is impacted by PFAS from reaching to the Cape Fear River. We're also reviewing a report that Comores has provided as part of the consent order, and this is titled their Total Organic Fluorine Report. This is required under paragraph 26 of the consent order. Our staff are completing the review of this report, and we will be reaching out to advisors and scientific experts for some additional reviews. Related to additional offsite assessment, on November 3rd, DEQ directed Comores to submit a plan for DEQ review and approval to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the groundwater contamination in New Hanover County and other affected counties that meets the requirement of paragraph 18 of the consent order. Last week, Comores submitted their response to DEQ's November 3rd letter, which includes a framework to assess Table 3 plus PFAS in New Hanover, Brunswick, Pender, and Columbus counties. This submittal and proposed framework are currently under review by DEQ and will be providing additional updates in the future SAB meetings. I'll move on to sampling that has been conducted as we speak through our DWR office and some statewide level sampling. Our DWR team is expanding their groundwater PFAS assessment for the lower Cape Fear River Basin. Again, this includes the Brunswick, Pender, Sampson, Columbus, and Southern Bladen counties, in addition to New Hanover County. We have initiated sampling of the DWR groundwater monitoring network wells in those counties, and we'll be providing more updates in the future. Regarding PFAS monitoring statewide, we are currently in the process of a long-term sampling project to collect water quality data from all wells in the network. The DWR monitoring well network consists of approximately 700 groundwater wells at 234 sites across the state. We will be sampling approximately 500 of these wells in the network, which would take 3 to 4 years. Samples have been collected for 159 wells at 62 sites. These samples have been analyzed for PFAS compounds using our lab. Those are the updates on our Comores-related implementation. I will also note that we have been in discussions with EPA as well as university partners in North Carolina to develop our additional next steps related to PFAS. As you hear today, EPA on January 13 issued an information request letter under the circular regulations to 2 facilities in North Carolina, the Comores Fayetteville plant and the DuPont plant that previously operated in Greensboro. The purpose of these EPA letters was to obtain existing information from these companies concerning how PFAS have been or are being produced, managed, stored, treated, disposed of, and released, or potentially released to surface water, groundwater, soil, and sediment. In North Carolina, as I mentioned, those 2 facilities were identified, but there were additional facilities identified in EPA's letters across the nation. So those are my updates on PFAS. On another high-level update, the Weaver fertilizer plant fire that you heard about last week, our divisions continue to coordinate with local and federal partners on the plant fire in Winston-Salem. The Division of Waste Management is assisting with specific materials management and disposal questions for the remaining material. Our air quality and water resource divisions are also involved in monitoring and assisting local officials with their effort. And then finally, my last update is something we haven't talked about much in the more recent SAB meetings. We continue to address the Colonial Pipeline Huntersville petroleum spill that occurred over a year ago. We are in discussions with Colonial Pipeline regarding a filed complaint against regarding the Mecklenburg County petroleum release. We're working on a resolution on several areas, including developing a total volume of the released petroleum amount. And Chair, I hope I didn't take too long, but I felt like there's so much going on I wanted to share with the board. Thank you.
There is a lot going on, and we'll hear more about the interface on department's PFAS roadmap path forward and how that interacts with EPA later today, as you mentioned. So yeah, thanks for the newsy update. I'll entertain a couple of questions from the board, but we'll remind you we have a busy calendar that's already eaten into your lunch break. So a couple of questions, if there are any, for Assistant Secretary Masemore.
This is Statliff, if I may.
Yep, you may. Thank you.
I guess there are quite a few questions these days about the air emissions monitoring related to the Fayetteville Works site, and I'm curious, and a lot of the language in the consent order is centered around Gen X and not necessarily many of the other fluor ethers that are also in waste streams of that facility. And I'm curious what plans there may be in place to enhance the analysis for other fluor ethers, especially since we do have methods for those other ethers.
Dr. Kanabe, can you clarify whether you're discussing the analysis of the stack emissions or other media?
Stack emissions as well, or stack emissions and the thermal oxidizer, but also dry wet deposition measurements.
Okay. If it's okay, I'm going to ask Michael Pajetra or Mike Abrazinskis to respond regarding what's planned for the upcoming tests. Mike?
Thank you, Shushma. Good morning, everyone. Mike Abrazinskis here with the Division of Air Quality. Dr. Knappe, thank you for the questions. And so related to stack emissions, the methods that are being employed right now are gathering several compounds other than Gen X in the stack test reports, and you can those can all be found on our website. I can't recite to you every compound at this moment off the top of my head, and certainly would be happy to follow up with you with that list as a follow-up action here today. Amongst some of those, I believe, include E1 and HFPO. Those that I can recall off the top of my head, but the others I cannot recall. We do expect, however, that from a control perspective, for the emissions, the process emissions that are being routed to the thermal oxidizer scrubber control system, that the efficiencies, the removal efficiencies will track very closely with what we are able to measure for all the other compounds will track very closely to what we are able to measure at this time. With regard to ambient sampling, I think was also a component of your question, and that's at this point limited to the atmospheric deposition sampling that Assistant Secretary Masemore mentioned earlier. At this point, the method that's being employed includes utilizing the analyte list that comes from the modified method 537. And so those are the compounds that we are currently analyzing for. We have done occasional samples, analyzed for the table 3 compounds in the consent order as well. And we plan to do more of that in the future. Michael Pajetra, our Deputy Director, just sent me a note helping me out with the target plan, target compounds for the stack testing. So I'll read through those very quickly. So thank you, phoning a friend here live on the webinar. So beyond Gen X, HFPO, which I mentioned earlier, the fluoroether fluoroether E1, which I mentioned earlier, both the HFPO dimer acid and the dimer acid fluoride, and then also carbonyl difluoride. So those are the compounds that are currently the targeted compounds from the stack testing.
Maybe just quick follow-up on is tetrafluoromethane something you're also tracking, which is one of the most resistant to thermal breakdown, and is a product that can form from longer chain compounds that enter the thermal oxidizer.
Right. Not that I'm aware of at this time, but that might be another thing that I can follow up on after the meeting.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Detlef, and for the answers. Mike Aberziskins, and great to have helpful deputies. I've been a deputy for a half a dozen years. Deputies help get things done. So good for Mike Projectress being there on the behind the scenes. We'll take one more question, then I'm going to move us to DHHS.
This is John Vandenberg. Just a quick question. It may be appropriate for the next meeting, but it's in regards to the fire in Winston-Salem. You mentioned that there was some air monitoring that had taken place. And of course, just following the news, it seemed like the initial concern was for the explosion potential from the ammonium nitrate. It would be, I think, useful for us to get a sense of the decision points there and the role of the different agencies in deciding what the scope of the area that was evacuated was, and the extent to which air monitoring may be continued to help support whether there are risks to the population from acute exposures. And my real point here is that oftentimes we look at longer term exposures, but under these emergency response conditions, it may be the short term exposures that are actually of greater interest, or certainly of importance to consider. So I just put that out there as perhaps a discussion point for the next meeting instead of today, because I understand it's still ongoing right now. Thank you.
Yeah, good point. There's a couple of things air quality wise that we could take a deeper dive on in the future. I think Dave Dorman's mentioned a couple of times being interested in the air quality implications of climate change, and DHHS's work on that. So yep, that'll be great. With that, I'm going to call on either Zach Moore or whoever else from DHHS is going to provide the update from Health and Human Services. But I think I saw State Epidemiologist and Epidemiology Section Chief Zach Moore signed in. So Zach, is it you or will it be someone else?
It is me. Can you, sorry, can you hear me?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
Okay, great, and thanks for the opportunity. I will be brief in my comments. I will start off, as I have been, with a short COVID update in terms of the pandemic and our response. Just noting that the overall theme over the past couple of weeks has been very rapid decline, but continued high levels of transmission as seen across multiple different metrics. So we have had levels as of last week that continued to exceed where we were with the peaks of the Delta surge or the prior surge, but very good progress in terms of declines. And we're seeing that also in terms of our hospitalization and intensive care unit admissions, which is something we've been monitoring very closely. I do want to flag on the COVID metrics that we've had continued expansion of our wastewater surveillance through the efforts of Dr. Guidry and her team, as well as our colleagues at the State Laboratory of Public Health and Environmental Health Section and the UNC, and actually NC State as well. We've had several folks engaged in that effort. So we are now up to, I lose count, I think we're up to 24 different municipal wastewater sites that are contributing, and wastewater surveillance just made its debut on the CDC's data tracker site as well, in which North Carolina is featured as one of 13 states participating in that surveillance effort. We'll be adding an additional 12 sites in the coming weeks and months. So that is all very exciting. Just having celebrated the 1-year anniversary of doing wastewater surveillance here in the state. Also now looking at ramping up or enhancing ability to use this tool, not just for tracking trends, but also for looking at emergence and spread of variants such as Omicron. So that's very encouraging and, you know, very in line with our overall shift that we're making in our surveillance strategies, trying to move away from case-based reporting and leverage some of the systems that have been either built or enhanced since the pandemic started, like wastewater surveillance and syndromic surveillance from a variety of sources. I think that's all I will say on the COVID front. In terms of other updates for the board, I've mentioned before continued work on our environmental health data dashboard, trying to pull together multiple streams of information into one location. That work continues, and we're hoping to have a launch. I don't have a date, but we're working towards launching the environmental health data dashboard. You know, additional functionalities there that should be helpful for people trying to get a broader sense of environmental contamination and certain health data. And then on the PFAS front, we have mentioned before work on a fact sheet on testing and tracing for private well water users. That has been developed, and we're receiving input now from some key partners on that. So thanks to those who've weighed in, hoping to have that made presentable and distributed soon to help private well water owners and users to understand their options there. I did want to mention a couple of staffing notes. Number one is Kennedy Holtz, who many of you may have worked with he's been with us for several years, but has now stepped into a new role as of last week as our environmental toxicologist. So we're very pleased to have him accept that role. And so he will be working very closely with the EQ and other colleagues and likely with this board as we go forward. So we're excited to have Kennedy Holt in that new position. I also wanted to mention, as most are probably aware, the governor did issue a new executive order on climate and equity, and Dr. Guidry, who you'll be hearing from later today, has been named as the environmental justice lead for Department of Health and Human Services on that work. So we're pleased that she has accepted that, and wanted to make others aware, as I know there's lots of linkages and connections that may be important as we go forward with the interagency statewide effort to address climate and health equity. So that is all I think I will say, but I'm happy, Chairman Augsburger, if there are any questions, happy to answer those.
Thank you, Zach, for the update. And sure, we'll take a question or two from board members. Great. Well, thanks for the news. We look forward to working with Kennedy Holt and Virginia in her new capacity, additional capacity, I should say, on the executive order. So thanks for the update. Great. Well, we're moving right along, which is good because we have a busy agenda of presentations. And I had to leave the last meeting a little bit early, but I understand this issue came up, and we probably should have addressed it sooner. I think it was Elena who asked for more background on the state rules, regulations, and implementation procedures for toxics and other media besides air. I think that's a fair way to say it. The history of the board before 2017 was focused on air. with the ambient air levels being the science that was derived by the board to be applied by agencies and managing that media by that rule. But we have, as was mentioned by Secretary Beiser at the outset, expanded scope, expanded media, and therefore need to have a more expansive knowledge of some of the underlying rules and regulations that our science is meant to inform. I remind the board members that we have advisory roles. We have roles related to deriving guidelines, reviewing guidelines, and consulting on the appropriate path forward between those. So the background from the experts that we have on the application of state law will be quite helpful. So this is in response to a request from the board. It's the presentations on state rules and regulations, and we're starting with Bridget Shelton and Chris Ventiloro, who are with the Department of Environmental Quality's Division of Water Resources, who are going to cover the application of standards related to protection of surface water and groundwater. In a virtual meeting context, it's sometimes hard to make it interactive. I would encourage board members to keep in mind the questions that we've been asked related to protective standards for groundwater, what we might get asked for surface water. Listen for how the rules and regulations are applied, particularly how standards for narrative and numeric standards for chemicals are derived and applied. And write down your questions. Maybe write down your questions in the chat so that we don't lose track of those. So with that, I don't know who's starting first, but Bridget and Chris, thanks for your time today in response to the board request.
Yes, thank you, Chairman Augsburger. So we are going to be trying to split this presentation. We'll see, we'll work through the virtual presenting kinks through that, but I think Chris is going to be sharing his screen.
Yeah, and I seem to have lost my ability to share. Oh, there it is. Okay. I will share the screen, and good morning, everyone. My name is Chris Ventiloro. Can you see my presentation or our presentation?
I can see it fine, and I can hear you both fine.
Okay, great.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'll get started. I'm going to stop my video to save on my internet. Okay, so good morning, Chairman Augsburger and members of the board. I'm Bridget Shelton, and I'm here with Chris Ventiloro. We're from the Classification, Standards, and Rules Review branch within the Division of Water Resources and DEQ. We're here today to present a brief overview of North Carolina's groundwater and surface water quality standards. They're also known as the O2L Groundwater Standards Rules and the O2B Surface Water Standards Rules. So there are three categories of water quality standards in North Carolina. Today, as I said, we're going to be focusing on the groundwater and surface water standards together to highlight their similarities and differences. Drinking water standards, however, is a different program within DWR. It's the public water supply section, and Rebecca Sadowski will be giving a presentation on these later today.
Yeah, so when we talk about water quality standards, one of the things that we like to do in the beginning is just to quickly define what they are. So in a very basic sense, they are state regulations or rules that serve to protect the surface and groundwaters of the state from the effects of pollution. Now, it's important to understand that these are legally enforceable values, so they can be used for regulatory purposes, which makes them a little bit different than things like health advisories or screening levels. And the waters are basically protected based on their best designated uses, which is something that we'll touch on in a little bit. And the standards themselves can be expressed as either numeric values, narrative statements, or a combination of both. This slide here is a lot of information, and in the interest of saving time, I'm not going to go through all of it, but I just wanted to point out a few key differences and similarities between groundwater standards and surface water standards. For groundwater standards, they're basically regulated through the North Carolina Administrative Code, which are the state rules that define the requirements of the groundwater standards. Surface water standards also are regulated through these state rules, but they also have an additional component where there's a federal requirement through the Federal Clean Water Act. Groundwater standards tend to focus their protections on human adults through ingestion and household use of drinking water from the ground, while surface water standards have kind of a wider range of receptors that include both humans as well as aquatic life and wildlife, and incorporate protections for ingestion, recreation, fish consumption, etc. Before we go too much further, we do want to point out that we do have some rulemaking in progress at the moment. So the 2020 through 2022 surface water triennial review is currently ongoing. And to see what topics are included in that, you can go to this link on the slide here.
And the O2L 0202 groundwater standards rules have also recently undergone a review, and they're currently in the rulemaking process as well. And again, more information on that can be found at this link at the bottom here. So how are water quality standards developed and applied? There are 4 steps involved with the development and application of water quality standards. So the first step is to define the designated use. The designated use describes the existing uses and desired water quality goals for a water body. Designated uses are described in the water body classifications, which are in the rules listed at the bottom here. So for surface water, again, that would be O2B, O200. And for groundwaters, it's O2L, O201. So water bodies are assigned a classification. This classification defines what the designated uses are for that water body. And it also describes the narrative and numeric water quality standards that need to be met to make sure that those designated uses for that water body are also met.
So water body classifications vary a little bit between the 2 different types of standards. For surface waters, there are multiple classifications that describe a variety of uses. Some of the examples of those classifications would be Class C waters, which provide a baseline protection for all fresh waters, Class WS waters, which apply specifically to waters classified as public water supply water sources, and Class B waters, which apply primarily for primary recreation, which is waters that are heavily used for recreation, such as swimming and other activities. The health and ecological related uses associated with these for surface waters would be fish consumption, water supply, aquatic life, and recreation. And for groundwater, the protection of groundwater as a resource for human consumption is the main use. So those, again, are defined in the O2L 0202 rules. And they just have fewer classifications, but the main protection is for water consumption. So the second step after the defining of the designated uses is to actually develop the criteria that support those designated uses. And again, as I mentioned earlier, for surface waters, we developed this criteria based on requirements established in the Clean Water Act, and also with requirements established in the O2B, O200 rules, which are the surface water rules. For groundwater, developing those criteria follow the requirements of the O2L, O202 rules. Now, in developing surface water criteria, we have a couple of different sources of information that we typically use. We first start off with the EPA National Recommended Water Quality Criteria. And these are basically recommendations that EPA publishes for states to use to develop criteria for substances typically of national concern. So it's kind of a broader look at toxic substances across the country. When there are no EPA national recommended criteria, we then default to our North Carolina narrative standard for toxics, which is in O2B 0208 rule. And this really provides the ability to generate numeric criteria for substances that do not have established standards in the O2B 02 rule. We could establish these for aquatic life as well as for human health. When we're looking at aquatic life, we're generally looking for information such as LC50s and chronic values, as well as acute to chronic ratios. When we're looking at human health criteria for toxics, we're basically looking for reference doses and cancer potency factors, which we usually obtain from EPA's IRIS risk assessments, but we can use other sources if those IRIS values are not available. And just to be clear, when we talk about human health criteria for surface waters, there's a few different types of human health criteria, but when we're discussing toxics specifically, what we're really thinking about here is water quality standards for the protection of humans consuming fish tissue, as well as protections for humans consuming water that's provided through a water supply. Now, these consider both non-cancer and cancer information, and we do have an established health risk for carcinogens, which is 1 in a million, or 10 to the -6, which is established in rule. And again, this is another dense slide that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on, but what I did want to do was just kind of give you an example of how we would go about calculating a water supply standard, for example. You can kind of see, if I can get my little pointer here, we incorporate a reference dose for non-carcinogens or a cancer potency factor for carcinogens. And then these get modified by a number of exposure factors or exposure estimates, which you can see listed out on the right here. And these exposure estimates that are highlighted in red are all actually defined in the O2B 0208 rule. So we have set body weights that we use for adults and children, set drinking water consumption rates, and set fish consumption rates. The other key thing to focus on here is the use of a bioconcentration factor or a bioaccumulation factor. And what these are is basically they're kind of estimates of the degree to which a substance will accumulate in fish tissue. And what the use of these concentrations in acute bioconcentration and bioaccumulation factors do for us is that they allow us to establish a water column concentration standard that should prevent or protect against the accumulation of a toxic substance in fish tissue to the degree to which it would be considered harmful to people consuming. And that brings us back to the groundwater standards.
Yeah, so as stated earlier, groundwater standards are developed in order to protect the groundwaters of the state as a resource for human consumption. So these are the maximum allowable concentrations of contaminants in groundwater, which may be tolerated without creating a threat to human health, or which would otherwise render the groundwater unsuitable as a source of drinking water for humans. So groundwater quality standards are established as the lowest of the following 6 criteria or endpoints. So a concentration protective of the non-cancer or systemic effects of a contaminant. We use a reference dose in this calculation, and I'll briefly cover the calculations a bit later. Second is a concentration which corresponds to an incremental lifetime cancer risk of 1 in a million, and we use a cancer slope factor in this calculation. We also look at the taste threshold limit value as well as the odor threshold limit value. And finally, we look at the National Drinking Water Maximum Contaminant Level, or the MCL, and then the National Secondary Drinking Water Standard. And these are aesthetic values, often based on taste and odor. So as you can see here, we do consider the EPA's MCLs and secondary standards for substances. If they are the lowest value of all of the criteria available listed here for a substance, they would be chosen as the value to establish as a groundwater standard. So the process for developing a groundwater standard for a substance begins by finding these values if they are available. The O2O rule also lays out which references are used when finding the endpoint or criteria values listed earlier. So the list of references in order of preference is listed here. So EPA's Integrated Risk Information System, EPA's Drinking Water Health Advisories, other EPA health risk assessment data, and finally other published health risk assessment data and published toxicological data. So we are limited to these references when we are developing groundwater standards. And again, you can see that we do rely on EPA, particularly the IRIS program, as it is first in the order of preference here when developing a groundwater standard. However, in the absence of EPA data or guidance for particular substances, we do have the ability to use other data as listed forth here. So another calculation slide, a bit more detail on how these are calculated. You'll see some similarities between the surface water calculations. So for the systemic or non-cancer threshold concentration, shown here as defined in the O2L rule, so we have a reference dose times the body weight, which is defined in the rule as 70 kilograms for the average adult, times the relative source contribution, again defined in the rule as 0.2 for organics or 0.1 for inorganics, and that's divided by the water consumption rate, or 2 liters per day for the average adult. Some of these values are also used in the cancer endpoint calculation at the bottom here. Again, in the rule, the risk level is defined as 1 times 10 to the negative 6, or 1 in a million, times the 70 kilogram body weight divided by the cancer slope factor, times the 2 liter per day water consumption rate. So for these calculations, the references that were shown on the previous slide are what are used to find the reference dose and the cancer slope factor to input here if available. So again, that's the EPA's IRIS values, drinking water health advisories, health risk assessment data, and other published and scientifically reviewed data.
So the next step following the development of the criteria is to establish those water quality standards in rule. And the process for doing this, it's a formal rulemaking process, which is known as the triennial review. And it's a very similar process for both types of standards. For surface water triennial reviews, I've shown a slide here just kind of summarizing the various steps. We've kind of broken it into 3 different stages. The first stage is where staff review the current standards, available guidance from EPA and other sources, as well as the scientific literature, and then present that information to the Environmental Management Commission, which is kind of the governing body that has the authority to adopt the standards into rules. And then we go out to public notice and also have a public comment period, as well as hold either one or multiple public hearings so that the public has a chance to participate in this process and voice their concerns. Following that stage, we enter into more of the state approval stage, where we gather all of those public comments that were received during that comment period, and all that information kind of gets summarized and brought back to the Environmental Management Commission. And the Environmental Management Commission at that point will kind of deliberate that information and ultimately determine what amendments to the surface water standards they approve. Once the EMC approves those amendments or those changes to the surface water standards, we then go to the Rules Review Commission, which kind of reviews the rules from a legal perspective to make sure that the legal language is correct and that the legal authority for whatever changes are being made is there. Once the Rules Review Commission approves that process, the North Carolina Attorney General's office signs off on those amended rules. And then, because the surface water standards are required through the Federal Clean Water Act, EPA actually has oversight of any changes to the state surface water standards. So that entire process of amending the rules then shifts over to EPA for EPA to do a Clean Water Act review. And as part of that, they do an Endangered Species Act consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and then ultimately notify North Carolina of the approval or disapproval status of the triennial review.
So the groundwater review process is similar. However, the groundwater program is not a federal requirement, so there's no federal approval step. So the groundwater rule and standards are reviewed using available literature and guidance, and staff develop a package or recommendation to take to the EMC committee and then the full commission. This recommendation can include updates to the standards values based on any new or updated information. The EMC then decides on whether to approve of any changes to the rule, which then go to public notice and hearings and public comment, as Chris mentioned. We then go back to the EMC for approval, then if received to the RRC for approval, and then if we get state approval, the rule is adopted as updated. So after all of these steps, defining the use, developing the criteria, and establishing the standard in the rule, the last step is to apply the water quality standards. So these standards are implemented in various water quality protection and monitoring programs. Surface water standards, for example, are used for permitting, 303D lists, and TMDLs. Chris will get into more details on the implementation of these on the next slide. And then groundwater standards are also used in various programs such as site cleanups, monitoring of wells, and risk assessments.
Yep. So as Bridget mentioned, there's a variety of programs that implement surface water standards. I think it's important to think about that in the sense that, you know, the establishment of surface water standards and groundwater standards really is kind of like at the beginning stages of actions related to the standards. So once the standards are established in rule, then our various water quality protection programs can use them based on the requirements, the specific requirements of those protection plans. So as a couple of examples, the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System will issue permits to dischargers using those water quality standards as part of developing a permit or monitoring limit. And it's important to understand here that the permit or monitoring limit is not the standard itself, but that the standard is used to develop those limits. So when developing those limits, other additional factors can be incorporated, such as allowances for dilution based on the flow of the receiving stream, background concentrations, also other things allowed are like mixing zones and things like that. Ambient monitoring data, the state has a few different ambient monitoring data programs that collect data of surface waters throughout the state. This data can be used to identify excursions of water quality standards and to determine if those excursions are sufficient enough to list that body on the federal 303D impaired waters list. If a water ends up being listed on that impaired waters list, then a total maximum daily load, or TMDL, will be developed to allocate the loadings for point and non-point sources in those watersheds to lower those in-stream concentrations to acceptable levels. And again, these are all different processes that have their own kind of requirements and methods associated with them. And then lastly, you know, standards can also be used for things such as just investigations into just various events that occur. Sometimes the standards will be used to determine compliance with regulated activities. So, you know, for example, if like a best management practice for stormwater or something is suspected of not being performing correctly, surface water samples can be taken to kind of compare to the standards to see if it would potentially result in an impact. And then there's also kind of more unusual situations or you know, atypical situations that may occur, like a truck overturning and spilling some kind of substance into a stream. And the standards can be used to inform whether, you know, we may suspect that there would be impacts to those designated uses because of that event. So there's a wide variety of ways that these standards can be implemented, various programs, and it's oftentimes the various programs themselves that have their own special requirements and methods with how they use those surface water standards.
So the groundwater standards are enforced and used in various programs as well. This slide lists some examples. DWR's groundwater resources section is responsible for protecting and preserving North Carolina's groundwater resources through its monitoring wells network, site assessment and groundwater corrective action activities, and permitting and compliance programs for well installations. So when the groundwater quality has been degraded, the goal of any required corrective action is to restore the resource to the level of the standards or as closely as possible. The Division of Waste Management also enforces the groundwater standards through the regulation of solid waste disposal, hazardous waste management, underground storage tanks, and Superfund cleanup sites. And then the groundwater standards are also used for other broad activities such as risk assessments and health evaluations, including for private wells in various programs. So thank you for having us today to present our brief overview of the North Carolina Water Quality Standards. Chris and I's information is listed here, as well as Jeff Manning, our supervisor, and Susie Meadows, who's on our team and provides water quality standards assistance. And our website is listed below. And we are happy to take any questions today.
Bridget and Chris, thank you so much. You've synthesized a lot of information. 15A NCAC is difficult to read. Thanks so much for putting it into slides and your own words. And at one point I took EPA's Water Quality Standards Academy, which was a week long and at that time in paper about 3 inches thick binder. You've done a nice job of walking people through classifications, standards, criteria, standards, their application into programs. Thanks so much. I'm going to start the questions with Elena, who, as I understand it, was the one who was particularly interested in seeking this out, and give her the floor first to see if she has any more, to see if her interests were served and if she has any questions about how our science is used to influence criteria or standards. So Elena first, and then I have one, and then I'll open the floor to others.
I thank you, Tom. I found this presentation really clarifying for me, and it did indeed answer the questions I had because a lot of it was based on what mechanisms they can be used to address surface and groundwater, and where the data comes from and how it's derived. So this was very helpful. And secondly, I would like to personally thank the state folks for really excellent presentations, very clear. And I will have questions probably as we move forward. But the questions I had were answered.
All right, great. I had one for, I think it's Chris, when we did the side-by-side comparison. Bridget noted an order of preference for where you find things like cancer slope factors and reference doses. Is there anything equivalent to that in surface water other than kind of like the two big steps of water quality criteria, or then you move into state rules for how things are done? It seemed like there was a parallel there in terms of orders of preference. There was a parallel there in terms of using existing information if it was available, and then moving into some workflows for how you could do it yourself. But I didn't necessarily see the strict order of preference that groundwater had in surface water. How do y'all handle that, and what is it?
Yeah, so thanks, Tom. Yeah, so unfortunately, it's not as clear. The O2L rules are really nice in that they're very clearly laid out. The surface water standard rules, thinking of context, they stretch back to the 70s, and a lot of the big changes happened in the 1980s with the rules themselves. So it's not as nicely kind of laid out in the surface water rules, but the way we typically handle it is that EPA publishes those national recommended water quality criteria, and there's a lot of work that goes into those criteria. EPA does a lot of internal work. They have similar science advisory boards that they use to do kind of external peer reviews. So we really rely on those primarily as our first source of information for developing criteria and looking to see what to adopt statewide. Now, when it comes to substances that we don't have national recommended criteria for, that's when we kind of switch over into that O2B, O208 narrative standard for toxic substances. And from there, even then, the way our rules are written is that there is kind of a heavy emphasis placed on the use of information provided from EPA. So the use of IRIS, Integrated Risk Information System, risk assessment information, so reference doses of cancer slope factors, cancer potency factors. But there is also an avenue there where if that information is not available, then we could look to other sources. And the way the rule is written is that, we could look to those other sources and then kind of, verify that information and proceed to use that if necessary. So I hope that answers the question.
It does, thank you.
Yeah.
I've got a couple of more, but I'm going to open it up to the floor for other board members, and you can come on camera or raise your hand. I can only see so many people on the screen, so floor is open.
This is Rich DeJulia.
Thanks, Rich. Go ahead.
So I'll echo Elena, great talks, both of you, Bridget and Chris. And so mine pertains to sort of the elephant in the room for a lot of these things like PFAS, which is mixtures. So I'm thinking in terms of, say, a specific groundwater or surface water, and you found a number of different chemicals. They were all below the criteria But still, if there were 10 of them were kind of pushing that, that would be, I would think, a big concern. Do you have a mechanism for dealing with that sort of issue?
So that's a good question. We are running into that now with these emerging contaminants, particularly PFAS. So for groundwater, we do have some language that does allow us to consider the effects of chemical interactions. To my knowledge, we haven't been able to use that yet, but we do have a mechanism that does exist.
Yeah, and for surface water, we don't have a kind of an explicitly stated mechanism for dealing with mixtures, but we do have narrative standards, again, that make broad categorical statements like the toxic substances shall not result in toxicity or chronic toxicity or something like that. So, and again, you know, we do have some old kind of, I want to say, legacy water quality standards that treat certain substances as a category, like chlorinated benzenes. That's kind of, I know EPA has kind of moved away from doing that and moved into more specific criteria for specific substances. But yeah, it is something that we need to kind of work on. And I think the way forward would be to kind of have as much information as we can get on the toxicity and how the different substances may affect one another. I mean, we see some of that with aquatic life studies on like metals, how you know different metals can react with one another, become more toxic or less toxic, etc. But I think that's kind of the path forward that we would take, would be to look to see if we could find any solid information that gives us an idea of how we could move forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Rich. I see a couple of people who've come on camera. So Jamie, and then Viney, and then John. If you have questions, I'll get to you in that order. That's okay.
Great, thanks, Tom. So as an academic scientist who spends most of her world in the laboratory, sometimes it's a little bit of a struggle to take what I do in the laboratory and apply it to the rules and regulations that you all have to create and interpret and enforce. So as a member of the SSAB, who does spend most of her time in the lab, what's the biggest takeaway that you'd like me to have when I consider recommendations that you may ask me to evaluate?
Yeah, well, I would say that's a great question. I mean, to me, I think the biggest thing, I think one of the biggest challenges we have in communicating with the academic community and the public in general is that, you know, we are kind of, when we develop these standards, we have certain limitations that we kind of have to follow. And I think for the academic community in particular, I would say if the academic community can have a little bit of a better understanding of what it is that we use, that we need to use, that we're required to use when we kind of calculate these numeric standards, I think that can go a big way, you know, a long way in us kind of communicating better and kind of focusing efforts, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, Chris. And I think I'll just add, I think it's also important to understand some of the challenges we face, as if you remember our triennial review slide, the steps we have to go through, the timing sometimes can be very long. So for these new emerging contaminants, we're kind of, I wouldn't say playing catch up, but we're just trying to really figure out how to balance the fact that it takes years to get these updates even through the process to then start again. And in that 3 years, there might be all this new information coming out during that time. So we're just always working hard.
And
I think,
yeah,
I was just gonna say, communication is so key in what we all do. So it's good to hear that communication and understanding plays a really important role in all of this.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great effort to kind of focus on. I know we've spoken with Franny about this in the past, about, you know, can we kind of increase, you know, the opportunity for us to communicate directly with some of the academic folks, to have more open discussions. It's a little bit harder now with COVID, but, you know, in the past, we've been able to do that a little bit more effectively, I think. But as we kind of hopefully segue out of COVID, we'll be able to kind of pick that back up.
Thank you, Jamie, Chris, and Bridget for that. Viney, and then John.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I too want to thank the two presenters for the clarity of their talk and the extent of work in water groundwater and surface water quality that's being done. My question really relates to Eastern North Carolina, which is heavily agricultural, both animal and crop agriculture. First of all, and they both use nitrogen in a very prolific way. I have a two-part question. The first part is, how do you figure out, or in fact, can you figure out that the nitrogen that goes into the groundwater is associated with either animal agriculture or crop agriculture?
Thank you for that question. I'm hoping I can give that to one of my colleagues who may be on the line who works more on the implementation side.
There's always the option too of saying, we'll check into it and get back to you. You've got all of our emails and meet every couple of months if it was a too big of a surprise question.
So, Mr. Chairman, should I carry on my second question or wait?
Yeah, maybe, because that'll give her a chance to look into it.
Okay.
And then we can circle back, unless you have an answer ready.
Okay, the second part of my question deals with the nitrate component, which again comes from both of these two, crop or animal agriculture. And you do monitor groundwater wells and the like in Eastern North Carolina. Can you give me some sense of how much of the groundwater, if at all, is contaminated or exceeds the nitrate, US EPA nitrate and water value?
This is Tina Graham, the Division Deputy Director for Division Water Resources. I'm going to see if I can help answer this question a little bit. Can you hear me, first of all?
Not entirely.
It's shaky.
Okay, I'm sorry. I just know that we how do we distinguish? The question was how do we? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear either. Can I hear this? The last part of the question.
Okay, the first part of the question was, how do you distinguish which of the two major industries in Eastern North Carolina, crop or animal, are contributing to nitrogen loading in groundwater or surface water? Because they are both equally important and they are both equally large, and they both use copious amounts of nitrogen one way or another. That's the first question. And the second question is, how much of Eastern North Carolina is contaminated, if at all, groundwater by nitrate loadings that are larger than US EPA's specified value, which is, I believe, is 10 parts per million nitrate.
That's correct. That's what we use, 10 parts per million. And as far as I don't. To see exactly where we have exceedances of that standards, you can go to our website and look under TMDLs, and you would see what areas have issues with nitrates in particular. I don't believe it's a significant amount of waters that we have a problem with nitrates or nitrites in the state. But I have to get back to you to get exactly which areas are affected. As far as distinguishing between animal and crop, we do mass loading estimates to try and figure out what's coming from the crop sources. When we do TMDLs to figure it out, but we're trying to get specific tests now to try and not only distinguish between how much is coming from animal versus crop, but how much is an issue from human waste versus other animal. But to be truthful, we need to get a little more clarification from our planning staff to know how clearly they're able to distinguish between the two. I hope that helps.
Julie, and thank you. John Vandenberg, you had the next question, I believe.
Yes, thank you very much. Bridget and Chris, you did a great job. It's hard to do a tag team, and you did a wonderful job of informing us, which is what we asked for. My question, maybe just as much to you as it is to the Science Advisory Board, is as I reviewed or saw the process for the triennial review process there, I didn't see a step for a peer review of any kind, typically early on in the process. You went from your staff development to management review and then into the Environmental Management Commission, I think. But I didn't see a role for a Science Advisory Board like ourselves or any peer review in the process. Do you or does anyone anticipate that that would be useful? And I certainly recognize that it adds time, which is very tight already for you. So, but if there was any benefit to having a peer review step, perhaps by the Science Advisory Board, would that be added value for the review process?
Yeah, I think there are definitely certain scenarios where it would be very helpful. You know, one of the things that comes to mind for me is, you know, especially when we're talking about contaminants of emerging concern, where there might not be a clear scientific consensus on, you know, the use of toxicity values, or, you know, a big one for us in surface water is identifying bioaccumulation factors and bioconcentration factors, and determining if, you know, those were appropriately determined, or which, you know, if there's a lot of variety in the results, you know, which way to lean. So I think there's definitely opportunity there in the future, especially as we're addressing contaminants of emerging concern. You know, for a lot of the more kind of routine stuff that we do, like the metals, a lot of that work has kind of been done on the front end with like EPA and other like industry groups and stuff like that, where there's been a lot of kind of peer review and discussion. But I think it'll really play into the contaminants of emerging concern.
I think that's a very good insight.
Yeah.
Those that are less certain is where the biggest issues are going to arise. That's right.
It's interesting to me that this is where the board has interacted before. If you just think back over the last 4 years of board work, we've commented on things like relative source contribution. We've commented on doses. We've commented on cancer slope factors for a couple of different compounds, hexavalent chromium, PFOA, Pfas, and Gen X, of course, that we started with. I was curious for both groundwater and surface water. So much of that was front loaded before it went to rulemaking, the criteria becoming the science basis that could be a standard, but the standard being the process of public comment, a couple of different board reviews. Is there any tool for groundwater or surface water in administrative code short of a standard, a guideline, temporary value, a screening value? Do those exist? Because it seems like, you know, there's a science answer, and then there's the science becoming applied in management. And I was curious about whether or not there's any interim step that might be useful for the agencies, just like a science synthesis prior to adoption as a standard.
Yeah, I'll go first. Thank you for bringing that up. So I'm sure you all have heard this acronym before. It's a little funny. It's called an IMAC. So that is in the groundwater rule. So we have language in the O2L rule that says when there is no standard and when a substance is not naturally occurring, it shall not be permitted in the groundwaters of the state above the PQL. So that's the practical quantitation limit. So that's a laboratory value close to the method detection limit. So it usually can be quite stringent, pretty low in value. And again, that is a laboratory value. So it can vary based on laboratory capabilities. It can vary over time. So in light of that, we have a procedure in place in the rule where anyone can petition the Director of Division of Water Resources to establish an IMAC. So that's an interim maximum allowable concentration in groundwater. They are calculated the same way as the groundwater standards. However, it's done by the Director of DWR. So that allows us to act a little bit quicker than a full rulemaking package going through the EMC and all the steps that you all saw. So we do have that ability available for the groundwater rules.
Is there anything equivalent for surface water, either for the aquatic life or for the human health component?
Yeah, thanks. There is something that's equivalent. It's not as clearly defined, so to say, as the IMAX are in the groundwater rules, but basically that narrative standard for toxic substances that I mentioned earlier, that O2B 0208 rule, that basically tells us that toxic substances can't result in chronic toxicity. So what that allows us to do again is we can calculate numeric values for toxic substances that we don't have standards for, and we can actually implement those values prior to them going through the full rulemaking process, because the ultimate goal there is protection of those designated uses. We distinguish those criteria that as in-stream target values, which is just kind of a name we came up internally to distinguish them from standards, with again the difference being that the in-stream target value hasn't gone through rulemaking to become an official standard, but it is still applicable and enforceable. And usually, we'll get a request if there's kind of a odd chemical that comes up in a permitting circumstance, or some kind of investigation in surface waters reveals that there's some contaminant that's been found. If the toxicity information is available, we can calculate protective values.
Thanks, Bridget and Chris. Assistant Secretary Macemore, I see you came off camera. Do you have a question or a comment? And then Detlef, and maybe that'll take us to the break.
No, I think the staff answered those questions just the same way I was going to respond. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Detlef, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious about scenarios where a chemical is discovered about which we really don't have health information. I'm thinking back at the time when through non-target analysis compounds like Nafion byproduct 2 or so were identified. What can be done in a scenario like that where we see that a synthetic chemical that most likely would be one of concern can be dealt with quickly rather than having to wait many years until all the information is available to plug in the numbers into the formulas?
Right, yeah, that is a challenge that we run into because we do have to have that health information in order to calculate a standard. We are fortunate to have that PQL language in the groundwater. So that is the laboratory value, which is essentially what the level would be. No substances allowed over the PQL if there is no standard or IMAC in place. So if there is no health value where we are able to calculate those levels, we do have that PQL there.
And for surface water, we do not have an equivalent alternative or an equivalent route to use the PQL. That's not something that's really been established through the Clean Water Act as a possibility. But I think what typically tends to happen in those cases is that we end up with a more kind of a specific approach to that scenario, such as the orders of consent and those types of efforts to kind of address the situation, figure out what's going on, and figure out ways to kind of approach it and limit contamination as best as is possible without having that toxicity information to calculate or establish, criteria or standards.
Would you have some mechanism in place and if many times it's when it's organic contaminants, they absorb to activated carbon, or if it's a smaller waste stream, one can use membrane-based processes. Are there ways one can be proactive and say, well, okay, we found this, technologies exist to remove this from the water. Let's make sure it gets dealt with while we figure out the rest.
Yeah, again, I think that would kind of come down to like those efforts to really, like the very specific efforts focused on that situation, like a consent order or something of that nature. where, basically with surface water, we're operating from, in these instances, we're operating from those narrative standards that basically say, no waste can result in impacts to the uses. That makes it hard to do things like establish a permit limit because we don't have an adopted, we don't have a criterion or an adopted standard to use. But I think when we have those circumstances, those types of options can be investigated to say, now, and that, I'll be honest, that stuff kind of occurs, outside of what we do on a typical day-to-day basis. But, I think that's where that possibility lies, is in those other types of efforts. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Chris. I'm going to bring us to the break. Thanks so much again, Chris and Bridget, for this morning's presentation. Very helpful. After the break, we pivot to a couple of additional set of state rules and procedures, also related to drinking water protection, but I guess more at the source. It'll be important to be back at noon because we have a lot going on. I think people are welcome to continue to post comments. If you didn't get yours question asked and answered, please post those. I think you're welcome to leave, stay online so you don't have to log back in, but if you do so, please mute and stop your video. So let's regroup at noon. Thanks so much. And thanks for rejoining us. I'm going to call us back to order and we'll resume the agenda at item 7, which is a continuation of the exploration of state rules and the regulations that implement those related to surface water and groundwater protection as it relates to human and environmental health. And we're pivoting now to drinking water. And we're fortunate to be joined by a different section of DEQ's Division of Water Resources, this time the Public Water Supply section with Rebecca Sadowski.
Thank you everyone for allowing me to come and present our drinking water regulations and what the development for the federal regulations as well as potential state regulations would entail.
You should be able to share.
All right. Can you see my presentation?
We don't see
No,
it.
not just yet.
We can hear you fine.
Okay.
You may need to open the PowerPoint first and then press share at the top and then application PowerPoint. There we go.
There it is.
Great. Excellent. So, like I mentioned,
it's in the mode of speaker view though right now. There you go. Perfect.
okay. Awesome. All right. So I'll start with the North Carolina Drinking Water Act. DEQ has primary enforcement authority for the Safe Drinking Water Act implementation. We adopt federal drinking water standards and regulations, and we implement them through the public water supply section within the Division of Water Resources. Generally, we adopt the federal drinking water standards by reference after the EPA has done all of the necessary steps required for federal development of regulations and has finalized standard values. In a few cases, North Carolina has used this authority under the North Carolina Drinking Water Act to diverge from federal regulations. We have not thus far, however, developed state-specific regulatory levels, and I'll give a little bit more detail on those deviations on a future slide. So onto the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act, because again, we generally adopt their regulations by reference. Congress enacted the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1974 and amended and reauthorized it in 1986 and 1996. It authorizes EPA to set national standards for drinking water to protect against health effects from exposure to naturally occurring and man-made contaminants. It applies to public water systems, Water systems, these are water systems serving 15 or more connections or 25 or more people, 60 or more days per year. And they're in 3 general categories. Community water systems, which you can think of normally as where people live. So the city of Raleigh is a community water system, Charlotte, a lot of our large municipalities, as well as some of our smaller towns. Non-transient, non-community are water systems where people go to on a regular basis, but not where they live. So these would include places of business and some of our schools. Transient non-communities are water systems where people would be passing through. So for example, a rest stop on the side of a highway. So you're not going to get a whole lot of your drinking water from that particular source. And those are important distinctions to be made later on when we're talking about what contaminants and what these different water systems have to do for compliance with MCLs. So the 1996 Safe Drinking Water Act amendments provide for a new regulatory determination process. And there's 4 major components of that process: the contaminant candidate list, the UCMR, the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, regulatory determinations, and the 6-year review of national primary drinking water regulations. And I'll go through each one of these in more detail in the following slides. First is the contaminant candidate list. A new list is published every 5 years. EPA collects data and encourages research on listed contaminants to better understand their health impacts and levels in drinking water. Known or anticipated to occur in drinking water, these contaminants are not subject to any proposed or promulgated federal drinking water regulation. They include contaminants of the greatest public health concern in drinking water. The contaminant candidate list is used for identifying priority contaminants, for information collection, and that's to feed into the unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, which I'll talk about next, and making regulatory determinations for contaminants with sufficient health and occurrence data. The current CCL is the CCL5. It was published in 2021, and it includes 66 chemicals, 3 chemical groups, including Pfas, cyanotoxins, and DBPs, and 12 microbes. The Unregulated Contaminant Monitoring Rule, UCMR program, is occurrence monitoring for up to 30 unregulated contaminants every 5 years. UCMR 5, we're in that current cycle. It includes 29 Pfas plus lithium, and sampling is going to occur between 2023 and 2025. So in just a couple of months, water systems are going to begin that monitoring primarily for Pfas. Water systems collect data for unregulated contaminants suspected to be present in drinking water, and it requires public water systems serving a population more than 3,300 people, as well as a nationally representative sample of public water systems serving less than or equal to 31 people to monitor. This is an important distinction. Prior UCMRs, UCMR 3 and 4, as well as before that, the level was not set at 3,300, it was actually at 10,000. So EPA has lowered that level, so we're going to have more water system data in the upcoming UCMRs. The larger water systems have to pay for this monitoring themselves, whereas EPA does provide funding for the water systems less than 3,300. EPA manages this program in partnerships with the states, so they have primacy of this, and we do have a partnership agreement with them where we do provide some assistance. Next, on to the regulatory determination process. This is EPA's formal decision of whether it should regulate a contaminant. The EPA must make a determination for at least 5 contaminants from the most recent CCL every 5 years. To regulate a contaminant, the Safe Drinking Water Act requires the EPA determine whether the contaminant may have an adverse effect on the health of persons, the contaminant is known to occur, or there is a substantial likelihood the contaminant will occur in public water systems, with a frequency and at levels of public health concern. And in the sole judgment of the administrator, regulation of the contaminant presents a meaningful opportunity for health risk reductions for persons served by public water systems. If EPA decides not to regulate a contaminant, they can still develop a non-enforceable health advisory level. So here's a graphic kind of showing how a contaminant would flow through this regulatory process. So in the beginning of the process, you have the CCL and the UCMR, and contaminants can flow back and forth between those 2 lists. And again, every 5 years, a regulatory determination is made on 5 contaminants from the CCL. And if a determination to regulate is come to by EPA, EPA has 24 months to propose a new rule. And then following that proposed rule, they then have 18 months to finalize that regulation. And then typically there is about 3 years in between the final rule and the compliance and implementation of the promulgated rule. So as you can see, I just wanted to point out that this is a fairly lengthy process. This is 6.5 years potentially at this point. That's after we have all of the occurrence data and the health effects data. And then after a rule has been in existence, every 6 years it's reviewed. If there's new health effects data or any additional data that would require the rule and it would be meaningful to modify that regulation, the EPA has to evaluate all of the rules every 6 years. So an MCLG. EPA reviews the health effects data and can set a maximum contaminant level goal. The MCLG is the maximum level of a contaminant in drinking water at which no known or anticipated adverse effect on the health of persons would occur, allowing an adequate margin of safety. MCLGs are non-enforceable health goals, and they're analogous to a health advisory level. They consider only public health and not the limits of detection and treatment technology effectiveness. Therefore, they sometimes are set at levels which water systems cannot meet because of technological limitations. So they're purely health effect based. And the MCLGs are set differently depending on the type of contaminant. For microbial contaminants, the MCLG is set at 0 because ingesting just one protozoan, virus, or bacterium may cause adverse health effects. For carcinogenic chemicals, the MCLG is set at 0 if there's evidence that a chemical may cause cancer and there's no dose below which the chemical is considered safe. If they have determined a safe dose, then EPA will set the MCLG at a level above 0. And for non-carcinogenic chemicals, EPA, the MCLG is based on the reference dose, which is the estimate of the amount of chemical that a person can be exposed to on a daily basis that is not anticipated to cause adverse health effects over a lifetime. Once the MCLG is determined, EPA sets an enforceable standards. In most cases, the standard is a maximum contaminant level. When there's no reliable method that's economically and technologically feasible to measure a contaminant at concentrations to indicate there's not a public health concern, EPA sets a treatment technique rather than an MCL. The MCL is the maximum level of a contaminant allowed in water, which is delivered to any user of a public water system. It's set as close to the MCLG as feasible, but it's not a 0 risk value. And treatment technique is an enforceable procedure or level of technological performance which public water systems must follow to ensure control of a contaminant. Taking cost into consideration, EPA must determine a feasible MCL or treatment technique. This is defined by Safe Drinking Water Act as the level that may be achieved with the best available technology or other means that EPA has tested and determined effective. EPA, when they're setting a health risk, a determination of regulatory values, they have to do a health risk reduction and cost analysis. This is to analyze the likely quantifiable and non-quantifiable benefits of compliance with the proposed standard and analyze certain increased costs resulting from the proposed drinking water standard. EPA must consider the incremental costs and benefits associated with the proposed and alternative MCL values, the contaminant's adverse health effects on the general population and sensitive subpopulations, any increased health risk to the general population that may occur as a result of the new MCL, and other relevant factors such as data quality and the nature of the risks. Where the benefits of a new MCL do not justify the costs, EPA can adjust the MCL for a particular class or group of systems to a level that maximizes health risk reduction benefits at a cost that is justified by the benefits. So once an MCL typically is established, EPA has to turn that into an implementable rule. So they have to consider a lot of different things when they're coming up with monitoring schedules and compliance requirements, such as which type of water systems are regulated. Community water systems are the most heavily regulated type of water system because that's where people get the majority of their water. But do transient water systems have to monitor for the contaminant? Where do they have to take the sample? What's the most appropriate location? Is it at the entry point after treatment? Is it raw water? Is it in the distribution system? How frequently do they have to sample? Is there initial sampling required, and then is there increased monitoring if they receive high results, or is there reduced monitoring? Are there any exceptions? For example, if there's a naturally occurring contaminant that a water system can prove is not found near their location, can we give them a waiver or a variance so that they don't have to sample for that contaminant, saving costs? Sampling, they have to develop sample collection methods, sample sizes, holding times, and develop analytical methods and detection limits, and then determine if there's adequate lab capacity for all the contaminants that will be monitored. They'll also have to determine and develop database compliance routines for identifying and tracking violations. We use EPA's Federal Safe Drinking Water Information System, SIDWIS, to determine, to hold all of our data and to determine compliance with the regulations. They have to create mandatory language and health effects language to be used in public notifications and consumer confidence reports, and develop the required timing of those public notifications as well. They have to develop best available technologies and significant documentation to help with rule implementation, including quick reference guides, primacy package applications, trainings, implementation guidance manuals. And all of these decisions must be based on data and sound science, which may not yet exist for contaminants not part of the EPA regulatory development process. So since North Carolina generally adopts federal standards by reference, we still have to go through our rulemaking process and can be several months in the making. And it includes preparation and submittal of a fiscal note, OSBM certification of the fiscal note, filing of rulemaking notice to the register, public hearing requirement, a comment period, approval by the Commission for Public Health for adoption of a permanent rule. And this is a distinction that I wanted to make. A lot of our other regulatory programs in DEQ report to the Environmental Management Commission, and we are regulated by the Commission for Public Health. So that is a distinction of our rules. Preparation of a permanent rule submission and approval by the RRC at one of their scheduled meetings. So again, that's a lengthy process for EPA to promulgate a rule. And then we've also got several months that we've got to make that a regulatory determination here in North Carolina and make that an enforceable rule. And with every adoption of new federal drinking water standards in North Carolina, our section staff have to perform outreach efforts to inform water system owners, operators, engineering consultants, and laboratory personnel of the new requirements. They must also perform other tasks to effectively implement the new requirements. There's a lot of outreach that goes on, mass mailings, training workshops, webinars that we do. We have to prepare and submit primacy package to EPA for approval to implement the new federal rule in the state of North Carolina. We have to develop applicable forms for the water systems and other regulated community. We have to update our laboratory analysis forms and analytical results, submittal procedures. We have to become skilled with the new database compliance routines and develop guidance documents as necessary. So the state implementation of federal MCLs and health advisories. For MCLs, our actions are fairly prescribed within the federal regulations. The regulations determine the compliance calculations for an MCL, whether or not water systems are going to have to perform increased monitoring based on their sample results, the timing and the language included in public notification, and the methods by which those public notifications need to be made. For health advisories, historically, they're non-enforceable regulatory numbers, and we have not done a whole lot with them in the past. However, more recently, EPA for manganese and cyanotoxins has provided a lot more guidance, including specific health-related language to use when notifying the public. So we communicate that information with the water systems and encourage public notification. And we provide technical assistance to the water systems related to those contaminants. And what we have not done thus far is make a value judgment pertaining to the consumption of water. If EPA determines that in their language says that the water is not safe to drink, then that's what we would communicate. If they do not state that in their health effects language, then we have not communicated that. We use what EPA has provided historically. So moving on to the North Carolina Drinking Water Act, we have a primary enforcement authority for the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act implementation. We adopt the Federal Drinking Water Standards and Regulations. And the North Carolina Drinking Water Act, General Statute 130A 315, provides broad authority for state primacy to implement the national primary drinking water regulations. As I mentioned before, there have been a few cases where we have diverged from the federal drinking water regulations. And a couple of those examples are here, where for arsenic and trihalomethanes, we have adopted the regulations earlier. As you recall, typically between a final rule and when water systems have to comply, there's generally about a 3-year gap to allow water systems to account for the cost of the increased monitoring and to plan for sampling and everything. And so at times we have adopted those regulations a little bit sooner than EPA. And we have had water systems sample at additional locations. What we have not done is develop state-specific regulatory levels, but we've expanded the applicability of EPA established levels. So considerations and constraints for state-developed regulations. This would be something that we have not done before. There would be significant resource needs, new staff capabilities, and funding. The extra monitoring and treatment costs for the water systems could be very difficult. Some of our water systems have they struggle with maintaining compliance with the existing drinking water requirements. Additionally, a lack of current data to make informed decisions. For example, contaminant occurrence. We don't currently have anything similar to a UCMR, so that would be something that we would have to consider. The health effects, do we have analytical methods for whatever contaminants we are considering regulating? What treatment technologies are available for the water systems to treat and remove the contaminant? We'd have to evaluate the costs, benefits, and do an economic analysis, including a fiscal note. And I wanted to point out here that with drinking water regulations, the cost is borne by the regulated community. So either the water systems, the municipalities themselves, or else they can pass that on to the consumers. Whereas with a lot of other environmental programs, including the NPDES permits, and the hazardous waste sites, it's usually the polluters that are bearing the cost of the contamination and to clean up. And so it's a little bit different for our regulations and something to consider. So in addition, once an MCL or some sort of standard is developed, we would then have to go through this process. And this is a similar slide to one that I showed before, so I'll just briefly go through it. But what types of water systems have to monitor? Where do they have to sample? How often do they have to sample? Is there increased, reduced monitoring? Would we grant any waivers to this? How do they sample? Do we have analytical methods and detection limits? Have they been developed at the federal level, or is that something we would have to do here in North Carolina? And is there adequate lab capacity? So these are things that we don't typically do, that we haven't done in the past, that would be all new if we were to try and regulate and create our own MCL here in North Carolina. Database compliance routines for identifying and tracking violations. Again, we use a federal database, and we wouldn't have that federal support if we were doing a state specific MCL. So we would have to determine whether or not we could use that same database and develop our own compliance routines. What about we would have to develop the mandatory language and health effects language to be used in public notification and consumer confidence reports, and the types and timing of those notifications. We'd have to develop and determine the best available technologies for whatever contaminant we're determining, and develop that training and guidance documents and materials for the state and for the utilities. So in conclusion, EPA has an established, comprehensive, deliberative process to set MCLs. It's definitely slow, but it's worked to minimize risk while considering multiple factors. We do not currently have the expertise or resources in place to create an equivalent process. That would be something that we would have to develop from scratch if this was a path that we were determined that we needed to go down. The safe drinking water has never meant zero risk. MCLs for many contaminants, including DVPs, volatile organic chemicals, synthetic organic chemicals, and metals, are set at levels greater than the MCLGs or health advisory levels. Again, that's due to cost and treatment restrictions. Creating a North Carolina MCL could potentially conflict with a federally developed MCL, necessitating reconciliation between the two. As we know, EPA is traveling the path of creating MCLs for PFAS and PFOA, and if we were to try and do that here in North Carolina, we would just need to be cognizant of, if we were traveling down that path, that we may not come to the same end conclusion. And once the federal rule comes out, we would have to reconcile the state and federal regulations. That's everything I had. Does anyone have any questions?
Thanks so much for pulling out the salient parts and running them in sequential order. Definitely helped increase understanding. The floor is open for questions.
Yeah, that's a great presentation. It was very informative. This is John Vandenberg. The question I have is, in the area where there's not a federal MCL, and I recognize the resources for the state to create one to be more than you have available, have you considered looking and perhaps adopting or reviewing what other states have done? Has that been something considered by the state?
That is not something that we've done thus far. All of that is relatively new. In a lot of the other states, if you look at, for example, for PFAS, they're regulating different contaminants at different levels. So they're creating somewhat of a patchwork of regulations across the country, which has been somewhat problematic. Thus far, we've not been tasked with that and have not made that analysis.
Okay, it might be something to consider, because I think there are some states that have quite strong programs to consider. The second point I guess I would make is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the last presentations, it's not clear if there might be a role for support from the Science Advisory Board to help the state in the review or in the different steps that are underway. So I would just put that out there for your consideration. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Other questions or observations from board members or staff? Are the states queried for input on the CCL and UCMR?
We sometimes serve on advisory committees for those regulations, and we're asked for input, typically through the Association of Straight Drinking Water Administrators. They take feedback from all the states and provide one comment letter back to EPA on those regulations.
Thank you. Detlef, I see you've come off of onto camera. Do you have a question?
Yep. Well, just an observation, and the observation is that EPA hasn't regulated a synthetic chemical for decades. And, you know, we, I think, need to recognize that we have a system, but it's not progressing very much. So I do think, you know, states that have developed frameworks to develop their own standards are able to respond a little bit better to this, you know, really broken system. Just an observation.
Thank you. Yes, it's definitely a very lengthy process.
Other questions or comments?
Dr. Augsburg, this is Sushma Macemore. Just wanted to make a note. Thank you, Rebecca. We're beginning discussions related to this topic. We'll be circling back with the SAB and others regarding what our findings are. We think there are opportunities for discussion and perhaps even formulating a path forward.
Thank you, Assistant Secretary. Jamie, did you have a question or observation?
Just the same comment that I made to the previous presenters. What's the major takeaway that you would like the SSAB members to consider from your presentation or from the body of knowledge that you presented to us today?
I would just probably the primary takeaway would be just the differences between the different programs and how the numbers are used, and just the different regulatory bodies, and yeah, again, who's going to bear the cost of this? There's definitely, you know, different, and for better or worse, if we're looking at, do we want to stop the pollution from happening in the first place and the contaminants entering into our resources, or treating it on the back end is a lot more costly, and other people are bearing that cost. So just something to consider moving forward. Not to say that, you know, we certainly, as Sushma Mazemore just mentioned, that we are having discussions right now on how we're going to proceed in the future. So things may be changing.
So
Understand the health advisor. Sorry,
oh,
go ahead, Jamie.
I was just going to say, so again, communication and making sure that we're up to date on communication and processes. So thank you for your comprehensive presentation.
Thank you.
Sorry, Jamie. Thanks for the question and observation. The health advisories, I know you said that haven't been used a lot in the past, but there's a couple of them out there. I think you mentioned for manganese. What has the utility been? I understand they're non-enforceable. Do you get a sense that they're useful technical assistance, or are they just information that's out there, and because it's not enforceable, it tends to be on the sidelines?
I would definitely say there's been a lot more action more recently based on health advisory levels. For manganese in particular, water systems are installing treatment because they're recognizing that, again, there's a secondary standard that's based on aesthetics primarily, but there are some health effects with manganese present. So EPA is kind of recognizing that, and I think that they're recognizing that, again, their process for regulating is very lengthy, and so they're kind of pushing a little bit more for water systems to take action if they are above a health advisory level. And the water systems are listening, and we have had water systems provide public notification for manganese concentrations above a health advisory level.
And you mentioned that compounds can go back and forth between the CCL list and the UCMR. Does it work the same way with health advisories, that things that are on the subject of health advisories sometimes make their way onto the more regulatory channel?
Yes, yes, they definitely can.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions or observations? We have a couple more minutes before we pivot to the next presentation.
I just had a thought as a follow-up to the comment on, you know, the fact that, you know, drinking water regulations, to meet them, that cost, you know, is really borne by the customers of the utility. Sorry, I was looking for the words here. But I also understand that it is easier to make discharge or develop discharge limits if there is a drinking water standard. So I think it's important to have that connection between drinking water standards and discharge limits at the same time.
Yes, that's an excellent point. And I heard Bridget and Chris earlier referencing that if there's an MCL present, that they can use that in their number development, which is then used by those discharge permits. So yes, it's definitely all linked.
Thank you.
The final call for questions or observations.
Hey, this is Elena.
Yes,
Just,
Elaine.
just an observation. In the past, when the board was media specific to just air, looking at what other states were doing and whether or not they had standards was a built-in part of the process, pretty much. And it was something that was always considered on one level or another, depending on the contaminant.
Yeah, I think we've we've mimicked a lot of the advisory board for air toxics practices in the work on hexavalent chromium. I think we heard from Canada, from Texas, from New Jersey, and from California, as well as the folks that commented on it publicly but requested those presentations. And I think it was John who mentioned earlier, there are some state programs that are fairly well developed. But that's something we can continue to do, is loop in what others have done, particularly if it's been done recently. All right. Rebecca, thank you very much for your time and expertise and walking folks through that aspect of drinking water protection.
Thank you very much.
And rounding out the presentations on the state legal foundations and procedures for groundwater, surface water, and drinking water protection programs for which our science advice can be helpful is Virginia Guidry with the Department of Health and Human Services, Occupational Environmental Epidemiology section in the Division of Public Health. And she's going to talk to us about the rules and regulations related to private wells. So thank you, Virginia.
Great, thanks.
That looks great.
Great. Okay, well, as Dr. Augsburger said, I'm going to round out things a little bit here by talking about private wells, which we haven't talked too much about so far today. And specifically, I'll describe the DHHS role in health guidance for private wells. Talk about the public health role, give a little more detail about our private well and health program, and then give a couple of examples where DHHS has contributed in this way. So first, a couple of aspects of the public health role for private wells. One is that since 2008, new wells have been required to be inspected and tested for certain contaminants. And I'm listing just a couple here. Bacteria and inorganic chemicals like arsenic, mercury, and lead are on that list. This is required by rule. And this piece for the inspection and testing of new wells is actually managed by colleagues at the on-site water protection branch, which is in the environmental health section of DHHS. So our one of our sister sections to epidemiology. And they work very closely with the local health departments to do this. So that's our partners there. And then in addition to those new wells, existing wells can be tested at the owner's discretion. So, and we provide support for that too, either through the on-site water protection branch, local health departments, if other homeowners want to test their wells, but it really is up to the owners to do so. And then the other part of the public health role for private wells is providing information about contaminants and recommendations for use or treatment options and how often sampling should occur. We do, along with those lines, we also provide input to DEQ on proposed groundwater standards. And if requested, we will provide guidance for public water supplies or to local authorities. And again, this public health role is required by the rule listed there at the bottom, the 3805 rule. So as part of that effort to provide information, we have in our branch the Private Well and Health Program. The goal is to reduce or prevent exposure to harmful agents that are found in private wells. And the staff that primarily work on that right now are Kennedy Holt, our environmental toxicologist, and Phoebe Shirtliff, who's an environmental health specialist in the branch. And we focus on bacteria and inorganic chemicals like arsenic, mercury, and lead that I mentioned before. For those chemicals, we help to monitor trends in contaminants. We help to understand the health impacts and determine treatment types. And then we develop fact sheets and FAQs as needed for those contaminants. And those are available on our website and shared with the local health departments as well. For other contaminants, and we have a couple examples of those coming up, we try to provide similar support, but typically there's less information for those contaminants, you know, PFAS being one of those. So we provide as much support as we can in those cases. So just a couple of examples. So one you're very familiar with our GenX Provisional Drinking Water Health Goal. And so that was developed by DHHS as the level of GenX in drinking water below which no adverse health effects would be expected over a lifetime of consumption. As we know, that is currently 140 parts per trillion, and we are anticipating the new EPA health advisory level sometime this spring, which will effectively replace that 140 parts per trillion when it comes out. This was calculated based on vulnerable populations. It's non-regulatory, non-enforceable, and, you know, as mentioned, can change as new information becomes available. And then along with calculating that value, you know, with input from colleagues at DEQ and advisory capacity from the SAB here, we also do a significant amount of health education. So here's just a snapshot of our webpage on GenX, of the fact sheet that we recently put out about the toxicity assessment for GenX that was released in the fall. And as Zach mentioned earlier, when he gave his updates, you know, we're currently working on a testing and treatment fact sheet as well related to PFAS chemicals. I'll just give one other example, which is radionuclides. In this case, Wake County, so the local health department in Wake County actually led an investigation in 2019 where they encouraged homeowners to test their wells for radionuclides. So that includes elements such as radon and uranium and radium. These are often naturally occurring and, you know, relates to the geology of the area. So that's what the image on the right is showing, the Rollsville granite that is contributing to some of these contaminants being in private wells in Wake County. And so in that case, they're naturally occurring contaminants, but, you know, well owners need guidance nonetheless on how to take care of their private wells and hopefully reduce exposure to these contaminants. So we provide that as well. And so when Wake County was doing their investigation, we helped to provide scientific information on the geological formations that were contributing. We developed FAQs for the health department to use and had several meetings with them. And then we attended meetings organized by Wake County to answer resident questions. And so in summary, and anticipating Dr. DeWitt's question about the key takeaways, you know, basically just an understanding that private wells are treated differently than our public water supplies and largely fall under the purview of DHHS. And in those cases, you know, we're providing health guidance and operate a little differently because the homeowners are responsible for their own maintenance of the wells. And so we try to provide guidance to them that will help them with the maintenance and protect public health. And I'll take any questions.
Thank you, Virginia. We appreciate it. I'll open the floor to questions after I say how fortunate we are that we had Dr. Guidry's and Dr. Sadowski's presentations to provide this foundation for the laws and procedures for protecting groundwater that's used for drinking water. Thanks so much. I had one question, I guess, to get it rolling. Is the difference between a private well and a public well, whether it serves one or more than one? Is there a cutoff about what's considered public versus private?
I think that question is probably best answered by DEQ colleagues, since we typically deal with the individual homeowners.
Yes, this is Rebecca again. So yes, it's typically based on sometimes population. So if they serve 25 or more people or 15 connections. And 15 connections, obviously there could be more than one person living in a household. So there's a general multiplication factor that we use for that. So 25 people or 15 connections in general.
Thanks so much. All right, Jamie.
Well, your anticipation of my question forced me to come up with a different question. Where is the best place for private well owners to get information about assistance that might be available for them in getting their water analyzed or tested or treated?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the challenges with private wells is that there's not a lot of assistance available. It really is the homeowner's responsibility. And by that, I mean, actual financial assistance to help with the testing or the treatment that may be needed as a result of the test results. We do provide information on our webpage for the sampling timeframes that are recommended and guidance, and we provide a lot of individual consultations for homeowners. So that's one of the things our team does quite a bit, and that's helpful because we can talk through the specifics of who's in the household and are there small children, are there infants there, do you want to consider that? Maybe there are not, maybe it's different, and of course people have different perceptions of risk as well. So we can do that as well. But as far as resources for actually doing the testing or treatment, we try to make them available whenever we have a little bit that we can offer in that way, but it's often pretty limited.
So a follow-up question, and I'm pretty sure Detlef will laugh at me for asking this, but when a homeowner samples a well, do they actually go to the well to sample it, or do they collect tap water? What are the logistics of sampling private wells on somebody's property? And Detlef, I'm sure you're laughing.
Typically the local health department assists and they collect the sample. Now there might be some exceptions to that, but often that's the protocol. So if someone's interested in their well sample, they'll contact their local health department and they'll actually come out and help and make sure. And I think it kind of depends on what people are looking for. For example, if they're looking for lead, they may want to collect that at the wellhead. It's a separate question. If you collect it in the kitchen, then it's like, well, is that the plumbing that's contributing if you're, determining? So it kind of depends on what is being investigated there, where it will be sampled, and the local health departments typically help to determine that along with the on-site water protection branch.
Thank you. No more questions right now.
You mentioned a small list of parameters, short list of parameters that are required to be measured when a new well is developed. Does the state have any influence over what that list is, or is that a cascade down from something else that's been established previously? And does that list ever change in terms of this short gotta-do list?
I mean, just to clarify, the list is longer than what I mentioned, but it is focused on bacteria and inorganic chemicals. And as far as how the list changes, I would have to get back to you on the specifics of the rule updating, but because it's part of the rule, it would need to be, part of that review and updating process. But I can certainly get back to you on how that occurs.
Great. Just curious. Seems like that could be a way to tailor something to the unique attributes of the state or a part of the state, if additional data to inform risk evaluation or risk management was important. Other questions related to either of the drinking water programs, protection programs?
Hi, this is John Vandenberg. Thank you all for your presentations today. I think we have the brain trust here, which is great, of all the different types of wells and drinking water, groundwater. My question actually relates to something that the board did a year ago or a little bit more than a year ago, which is we were evaluating the potential, the ways that hexavalent chromium could be evaluated in water. And I'm a little bit unclear where that stands now. I wonder if you or others could help us understand what the state situation is regarding hexavalent chromium.
Tom, do you want to answer that, or shall I start and you can add?
Oh, y'all can start.
Okay.
I really would defer to you all.
Okay, so the board's review on that was really helpful, and largely what it did for our work at DHHS was help to confirm the approach that we had been taking when we had been giving guidance to homeowners about hexavalent chromium. So, you know, the review basically provided that additional insight, and, you know, because we were already operating in that way, we just have continued operating that way, but we would have changed our protocols if the board had come up with a different recommendation.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was interesting under the earlier presentation on groundwater sequence of rules, and that you picked the lower of several different approaches. The charge on hexavalent chromium was, do you have more confidence in a cancer mode of action or a non-cancer mode of action? And it looked like, according to, for that particular application of groundwater standards and derivation, that you'd have to do it both ways and see which one, you know, gave you the lower value. And that could be different for surface water, and it could be different for drinking water, but it looked like there was a lowest of several different endpoints, one for groundwater. And I was thinking about the hexavalent chromium charge question there, which may not have been as relevant in that case. Other questions for Virginia or Rebecca? Okay. Thank you both. We appreciate it. And I'd encourage people, if other questions arrive or observations, to share those with the presenters, or you can share them through Randy Nilsson as a liaison to both of the departments we serve. And thank you, Elena, for teeing up this topic at the last meeting in terms of the foundations for the work that we do. We are running just a smidge ahead of time, so I'm going to say that we can take a short break, about a 5-minute break, and that will give our next speaker, Aaron Jones, a chance to know that they're next, since the time is a little bit advanced. And we'll regroup, let's say, at 5 minutes from now, which according to me would be 12:57. We'll get started again then, and I'll put that in the chat. All right, thanks. We're fortunate to be joined this afternoon by Aaron Jones, who's a special assistant to the Southeast region of EPA's regional administrator. If you recall, over our last 2 meetings, we've heard from Sushma Meshmore and others on the state's approach to working on PFAS and other emerging contaminants. In my words, an evolution of the state's approach, which leans heavily on being cognizant of and working in partnership with EPA, and leans heavily and is cognizant of the work that's unique and going on in North Carolina, whether that's at academic institutions or in the private sector. We have Aaron with us today to talk about the components that EPA leads and is doing since the last time that we met. So that'll be both an update and serve as useful background material as you consider the state's emerging approach. So thanks for joining us, Erin.
Thank you, Tom. I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully. Not an expert at WebEx. We typically use Teams and Zoom, so bear with me here.
The screen looks great, and I can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Awesome. Great. Good to know. So yes, I'm Erin Jones from EPA Region 4, based out of Atlanta. That's the Southeast region. We've got the 8 states of the Southeast and the 6 tribal nations down here as well. So I was special assistant. I'm now in a new role as of the last couple of weeks. So I'm an emerging contaminants coordinator, which is a new position in the region that is trying to keep up with all the things going on in PFAS and beyond in the emerging contaminants world. So it's exciting. It's an exciting time to be at EPA, and very fortunate to be working with North Carolina the past, couple of years. A great state partner on this particular effort, to be sure. It goes without saying. So I will run you guys through kind of the PFAS strategic roadmap presentation. I'm going to spare you kind of the beginning fluffy parts and kind of get right to the actions. I heard that you guys might be interested in hearing some of the regulatory things in process, status, and where we hope to be in the coming years. So I'll get right into it. Quick overview. I'm sure you're all familiar that EPA's Council on PFAS was formed by Administrator Regan back in April, and he charged that senior level multimedia group of leaders to determine the agency's next steps on PFAS in the new administration. So last October, the PFAS roadmap was released right there in North Carolina, as I'm sure all of you know. And I'll go through kind of the actions and next steps again, as I said. Let's jump right in to the first overarching principles of the roadmap are to consider the life cycle of PFAS, get upstream of the problem, hold polluters accountable, ensure science-based decision-making, and prioritize the protection of disadvantaged communities. And then there's some broad themes and goals that we're trying to rally around, which is research, investing in research and development and innovation so that we can understand exposures and toxicities, human health and eco effects, and also effective interventions as we go forward to remedy. We're looking to restrict and put comprehensive approaches in place to proactively prevent PFAS from entering the air, land, and water. And then, of course, remediation is key as well, and a key part of our roadmap going forward. We're looking to really accelerate a lot of the authorities and use of authorities to get at cleanup. So those are the broad overarching ideas, and then a lot of the actual policy work is very much up at headquarters in the national program offices. So this first office I'm going to focus on is the Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention. This is where the agency's authorities under TSCA, or the Toxic Substances Control Act, are housed. So this is a key part of the prevention piece of the roadmap. So the first action under TSCA is this PFAS testing strategy, which is a step towards a goal of breaking PFAS into distinct categories that we can use to direct research, amplify regulatory action, and accelerate technology and policy solutions to restrict and remediate PFAS. So this testing strategy was released at the same time as the roadmap. And, it started with a group of 6,504 PFAS that was based on OCSPP, that office's definition of what a PFAS is. So that's where they started. They categorized those 6,000 PFAS into 70 categories that were statistically similar in structure. And then they reduced that down to 56 categories that were lacking any tox data. And then they further reduced that to 24 categories that EPA could identify a manufacturer to go ahead and send a test order out to. So there are 24 representative chemicals in this first phase of the strategy that orders should be issued fairly soon. And so you can refer to that. It's a rather lengthy background document on that on our PFAS webpage. But where we are in that process is those first 24 orders should be getting issued soon. Also under TSCA, we're looking to ensure a robust review process. Last April, we went and closed a loop loophole on new PFAS being proposed for use in commerce, where we did not allow low volume exemptions to occur for PFAS because of the complexity of issues that arise. And so basically it was kind of a loophole that used to exist and allow these chemicals to come on the market quickly. We closed that loophole, and then the next bullet also is reviewing existing PFAS under TSCA. So close that one loophole, and we're also going to look backwards at the ones that got in before that time. And we're looking to ensure that the chemicals we had previously allowed onto the market don't present concerns, and to prevent resumed production of legacy PFAS or their use in new ways, because sometimes those would come onto the market in a new way and kind of make it, and we wanted to take a look back and make sure we caught those things. So the next thing under OCSPP is looking to enhance PFAS reporting under the Toxics Release Inventory. So if you hear TRI, that's what that is. And by proposing a rulemaking to remove exemptions and exclusions for toxic chemical reporting. So that's expected this spring. And also the EPA did just add 4 more PFAS. There was a press release a couple of weeks ago on January 24th. So PFBS and its potassium salt, along with 2 more PFAS, were added to the TRI back in January. And then the last bullet under OCSPP is to finalize a new PFAS reporting under TSCA Section 8, which is expected this winter. And this would better characterize sources and quantities of manufactured PFAS in the United States. This was proposed last June, and comments were accepted through September. And as proposed, it would collect information on uses, production volumes, disposal, exposure, and hazards. And as of last April, there were about 1,300 PFAS that might be covered. And these were existing chemicals that are manufactured, processed, or imported in the United States. And then 669 of those 1,300 at that time were determined to be active inventory in U.S. commerce. So this is a broad information gathering authority that we're putting into play here. And we're going to get a lot of information on a lot of PFAS that are believed to be in commercial use. So that will be very useful going forward to kind of better understand what is out there. So for the next office we'll focus on is Office of Water. And of course, they have quite a few actions ongoing. We just got a great update on the first bullet there, which is the undertaking of the nationwide monitoring for PFAS in drinking water, which is the UCMR 5 that Rebecca just took us through. So that was a great, I won't spend too much time there except to say that, we are on a continuing resolution in the federal government, so that the funding for this year hasn't been passed by Congress yet, the official budget. And so some of the testing, the smaller water systems that's proposed or that we're hoping to be able to fund is dependent on those appropriations passing. So hopefully they will. But I just want to throw that out there as I think the current CR ends in a couple of weeks on February 18th. And I've heard we may get another one before we finally get a budget. But at some point, we'll be able to say definitively we're going to be able to fund the testing of all systems serving more than 3,300 people. And then I think it's 800 representative public water systems that serve less than 3,300 would be included if we get those appropriations. And one more thing to mention about that is there are 2 upcoming public webinars on that UCMR 5 process on March 16th and 17th. So if you want to join those and learn more about that entire process and participate in the webinar, just Google EPA UCMR 5, or I can drop a link in the chat maybe at the end, and you guys can register for that and be a part of that March 16th and 17th. The next thing under water is the National Primary Drinking Water Regulation for PFOA and Pfas, which of course would set enforceable limits and require monitoring of public water supplies. We've got that proposed rule set to go out in the fall of 2022 this year, and the final rule will follow 1 year later, fall of 2023. As part of that, I'm sure a lot of this group's already familiar of the fact that EPA has asked the Science Advisory Board to review 4 draft scientific documents regarding health effects of PFOA and Pfas. So, where we are in that process is that SAB had several meetings in late December and early January to discuss the documents. And as a summary of those public meetings, that we have preliminary agreement on the major science pieces of those assessments. So the Office of Water was really pleased with kind of how those landed, and you know, I'll probably don't need to do this for this group, but really quickly, just in case, they expressed support for dose additivity among PFAS with common health outcomes. So for mixtures of PFAS, kind of adding up where appropriate the concentrations that might be present and the health effects, assuming kind of a additive effect there. Supported the use of the epidemiology studies as a basis for non-cancer chronic FRDs, and then specifically the developmental immunotox outcome in children as the significant adverse health effects. So the SAB was supportive of that. For PFOA, for cancer, they were supportive of EPA's change from the 2016 suggestive classification to likely. And for PFAS, the panel agreed that the classification was at least suggestive, with some indicating additional studies could change it to likely. So that was where the panel kind of landed, was the carcinogen aspects for PFOA and PFAS. And then finally, the panel did support a 20% relative source contribution for the looking at exposures beyond drinking water. So this health advisory is obviously just focused on drinking water, but this relative source contribution helps account for the fact that your exposure might not just be through drinking water, that you might get exposure through commercial products. And the SAB supported that 20% threshold to kind of adjust for that. The next steps on this is that we expect a draft report to be posted online in March. And by May, we may have as early as May, may have a final report on this. And so where does that play into the, would EPA update potential health advisories? And our Office of Water is saying they're going to move as quickly as possible to issue updated health advisories for PFOA and PFAS, depending on where these reports land and when they finalize. And just as a side note, the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was signed into law back in November, will invest $10 billion to support efforts to test for and remediate PFAS and other emerging contaminants in both drinking water and wastewater. And we are expecting guidance on that funding soon. I know a lot of our states have been asking kind of when that money is going to be here and how they can use it and that type of thing. So once we get that guidance, as soon as we do, we turn that around to make sure that we can hit the ground running with that funding. So the next bullet is the toxicity assessments for Gen X and the other 5 additional PFAS that were making their way through the IRIS process. So, that I'm sure this whole group knows about the Gen X final tox assessment being published in October. And that definitely updated from the 2018 draft value, applying revised uncertainty factors and newer data, and took that through the state-of-the-art systematic review process, which resulted in that lower number for Gen X chemicals relative to our original 2018 draft tox assessment. Just last week, EPA released a draft PFHXA tox assessment for public comment. So if you hadn't seen that, you can go make public comments on that now through April 4th. And then there's also 2 upcoming peer review meetings regarding the PFBA tox assessment on February 22nd and 23rd. So I just want to make sure that y'all as a group knew about those 2 opportunities to engage on those 2 tox assessments. Another goal under OW is to publish health advisories for Gen X and PFBS based on the final toxicity assessments. So along with what we've got going on with PFOA and PFAS, the same group of folks is looking at getting actual health advisories out for Gen X and PFBS, and expected this spring. And then we're looking to also restrict PFAS discharges from industrial sources through multifaceted effluent limitations guidelines programs. So that's going to establish national technology-based regulatory limits, and including some progress on the 9 industrial categories that the proposed PFAS Action Act of 2021 set. So that's expected in 2022 and ongoing. We're also looking to leverage the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, permitting to reduce PFAS discharges in waterways at the sources, and to obtain more comprehensive information through monitoring on sources and quantity of the PFAS discharged by these sources. So while we take action on the whole industry categories using the ELG program, we're also leveraging the power of the nationwide NPDES program to help communities and states know more about and, if needed, take action to address at a particular facility. OW is also involved in improving analytical methods. So there is a draft method out called 1633 that would be for 40 different PFAS. And it was an effort with DOD to get that one out to be monitored in 8 different environmental matrices. So that method was single lab validated in its draft, but we are hopefully on target to get that multi-lab validation done and published by the fall of 2022. And there's also an effort in OW to update the methods for drinking water monitoring, and that is on target for fall of 2024. Then we are looking to publish the final recommended ambient water quality data for PFAS for aquatic life and human health. So that respectively is expected in winter 2022 and fall 2024. And the other 2 things on the OW list are the data availability on PFAS and fish tissue. So they're looking to sample fish tissue in lakes across the country this summer and hope to have some data and informed guidance out to federal partners, state and tribal, to help tribal efforts setting PFAS fish advisories by spring 2023 based on that data and that effort. And then the final thing under OW is to finalize the risk assessment for PFOA and PFAS and biosolids. So that would serve as the basis for determining whether regulation of PFOA and PFAS and biosolids is appropriate, and that's expected by winter 2024. So I'll move on to the next office really quick, and this actually is 2 offices on this slide. I heard that you guys might be particularly interested in the cleanup stuff under the Office of Land and Emergency Management. So I'm going to do a deeper dive than what's here on this slide for that, but I'll quickly talk about the Air and Radiation Office, where they are looking to build the technical foundation to address PFAS air emissions, including designation as potential hazardous air pollutants or HAPs, by identifying sources, developing monitoring approaches, and information on mitigation technologies, and increasing our understanding of fate and transport of PFAS air emissions. And that's expected, kind of a status of where we are is expected by fall of 2022 and ongoing for that office. So going on to the deeper dive into the OLEM items, the first one is the proposal to designate certain PFAS as CERCLA, don't need to spell out that acronym, CERCLA or Superfund, more commonly referred to hazardous substances. So we are committing to designating those as hazardous substances, and this would be the first time that these 2 chemicals, or first time that any 2 chemicals have ever directly been added to CERCLA's hazardous substance list. And once we do that, we'll finally be able to leverage EPA's Superfund authorities to gather information on releases, hold polluters accountable, and recover costs for cleanup. So the proposal actually made its way to OMB a couple of weeks ago for interagency review on January 10th. We are still on track to schedule the publication of that proposed rule for public comment by this spring. And if all holds, we will be on schedule to finalize that rule in summer of 2023. The next item under OLEM is that we would issue an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, or ANPRM, on various PFAS. So this is besides PFOA and PFAS. That's expected later this year. An ANPRM is basically a request for information from the public. So it's not a proposed rulemaking, but it can provide the basis of a future action. So we will likely request information and input on the possible designation of other PFAS, again, besides PFOA and PFAS, as CERCLA hazardous substances. And the plan is to publish that ANPRM after the comment period closes on the proposed rule for PFOA and PFAS, aforementioned slide. So that's kind of where that will fall into the scheme of actions under OLEM to seek information from the public. Another item under OLEM that is really important, I think, to regions and states and local folks dealing with real world problems is the issuing the updated guidance on destroying and disposing of PFAS. This is expected by the fall of 2023. The interim guidance was first published in December of 2020, as it was directed under one of the previous National Defense Authorization Acts. So it requires updating at least every 3 years. And this schedule that we're on is going to allow for the developments in research. There's so much research going on about destruction and disposal. So we're hoping that the next iteration of this guidance will be more informative. And we got about 5,000 public comments on this interim guidance when it went out previously. So there's a lot of interest in this, and certainly a need for it as far as how to responsibly handle the end-of-life management of PFAS. Sorry, I lost my mouse here. The next one, I think this is the final one under OLEM, is that we are initiating 2 rulemakings under RCRA, which is another statute that you won't actually see in the roadmap, but soon after the roadmap was released, EPA responded to a petition from the governor of New Mexico, and we announced that we'll initiate 2 rulemakings under RCRA. So RCRA, again, is kind of the cradle to grave statute that helps us handle hazardous waste. And the 2 specific actions that we're looking at proposing is that we'll initiate the process to add 4 PFAS as RCRA hazardous constituents under Appendix 8 of RCRA. So specifically the 4, PFOA, PFAS, PFBS, and Gen X, which you'll notice are the 4 that we have final tox assessments for. If this is completed, this action would make these PFAS subject to RCRA corrective action requirements, and then would be a key step towards listing them as hazardous waste. So for future hazardous waste, and that's where the full brunt of RCRA would come in. Once they're listed hazardous waste, that's the full cradle to grave management of the waste. So this is an interim kind of step towards that. So again, if added to Appendix 8, they'd be subject to the corrective action requirements at hazardous waste storage, treatment, and disposal facilities. The second action that we proposed for RCRA was to initiate a separate rulemaking to clarify that RCRA Corrective Action Program has the authority to require investigation and cleanup for waste that meet the statutory definition of a hazardous waste. So the defining thing to notice there is that PFAS are not regulatory hazardous waste. So that, again, they don't have to have that cradle to grave management yet, but there is a different definition of hazardous waste in the RCRA statute, which is the statutory definition, and it's a broader definition. And we're, as we put this separate rulemaking out, we'll be clarifying that we believe that the RCRA Corrective Action Program has the authority to stretch over PFAS and other emerging contaminants. So that is the OLEM update. We'll go to the next office, which is a very important one, the Office of Research and Development. So again, there's quite a bit of research going on. Certainly a high priority for ORD is moving all sorts of things forward on PFAS, advancing our knowledge. So we're looking in that office to develop and validate methods to detect and measure PFAS, and that's including the targeted methods for measuring specific PFAS, non-targeted for identifying unknown PFAS, and exploring total PFAS methods. They're also looking to advance the science to assess human health and environmental risks from PFAS by moving forward with these toxicity assessments under the IRIS program. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with that already, but ORD is very engaged on that work. And then I just wanted to highlight that they do have an upcoming water research webinar entitled Open to the Public, so anybody on this call could join it, assessing the toxicity of PFAS chemicals to aquatic organisms. So that is going to be Wednesday, February 23rd from 2 to 3. And again, anybody can join that, and I'll try to drop a link in the chat later so you can see the flyer for that and register. And then the third thing ORD is looking to do is evaluate and develop technologies for reducing PFAS in the environment to inform decisions on drinking water and wastewater management, contaminated site cleanup, remediation, air emissions, and end-of-life management. So really, ORD is looking at the whole picture and trying to advance our knowledge on multiple fronts. They have a really good website. Again, I'll drop it in the link. Drop the link in the chat a little later. That encompasses all of the work they're doing, all the papers, research papers they've published on PFAS so far. So it's a really good source to kind of catch up on all the ORD activities. Lastly, we have several actions under the cross-program theme. First off is looking to engage with affected communities in each EPA region. The PFAS Council is looking to start that up really soon. We want to hear how PFAS contamination impacts lives and livelihoods, and incorporate the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council as well in that effort. So that is a focus and a priority right now. Of course, always enforcement tools to better identify and address PFAS releases at facilities as appropriate. So that is ongoing and definitely underway. And we're also looking to accelerate public health protections by identifying those PFAS categories. So a part of that was the aforementioned OCSPP offices, attempt at categorizing and looking at toxicity based on structural similarities. Another aspect of this is grouping based on toxicity, and then also looking at removal technologies. So are there certain groups of PFAS that could be addressed by certain removal technologies, and then looking, do we have gaps where we don't have a removal technology, but we do have a high risk or unknown risk. And so that will help us identify some gaps and help us focus our efforts to see if we've got any issues we need to move forward quickly on there. So then we are establishing a PFAS voluntary stewardship program. We're challenging industry to go above and beyond to reduce overall releases. So that is expected to be underway this spring. And we're also looking to educate the public about risk of PFAS and be a little better about risk communication in general. We've heard that from our states a lot, that risk communications around PFAS is difficult. And I will say that we do have a little start on that on our epa.gov/PFAS webpage. There is a PFAS explained portion at the bottom that has 3 different kind of plain language explainers on PFAS. And so if you have anybody that's reaching out to you and they're early in their journey to learn more about PFAS, is a great place to send somebody to kind of start and then you can dig in from there. But did want y'all to know this group that we have that out as of last fall. And then we're of course going to be tracking our actions under this roadmap, and we'll have an annual public report. So as the anniversary of the roadmap approaches next fall, we'll have our first annual report in the winter of 2022. And so of course, the next step slide is basically just emphasizing the fact that we'll be engaging along the way. We've held some national webinars to share the roadmap, had a lot of listening sessions, and again, we're going to be going into the impacted communities this year to hear directly from them. And so in a nutshell, just looking to really engage and hear from everybody on the roadmap actions. As a regional person, it's important to me to hear from states, so I'm glad to be here today. And also, we can, as regions, and we're starting to get a little more organized as regions, especially on the PFAS front, elevate the things that are facing at our state and local level and tribal communities as well. So we're kind of we're not in the policy making offices of EPA, but we definitely are where we're here to listen and help convey up and help elevate issues. So I will end my presentation with saying that I'm here and glad to take any questions now, or if you think of anything in the future. And we're always looking to share information as it comes in, because this is all changing very quickly. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks both for the overview of what's in the PFAS strategic roadmap and the way that you broke it out by program office. It does help see the scope of the issue when you see it that way, as opposed to thinking about it just on a compound by compound basis, which can be overwhelming itself.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us today. And are those positions, the emerging contaminants coordinator, is that something unique to the Southeast, or do they have those now in individual offices around the country?
So I would say that the PFAS coordinator kind of role in the region started largely in the offices of water, at the water divisions in the regions, because that's, I think, where we first saw PFAS, show up, even though we know it's well beyond that, right? But at first it kind of started there. And so I would say there is a PFAS coordinator of sorts in every region. Most of them are sit in water. Some of them are in like Superfund or a lab, a regional lab office. And I think our region recognized the need, especially with the recent roadmap actions, going more toward, not more toward, but also inclusive of and pursuing more hotly cleanup actions. So we just wanted to make sure that this position was not just buried in one division and siloed, but something that we could see the broader picture and hopefully make connections, because there's so much going on. It's challenging for me each week just to keep up with all the things, all the new things, and make sure that people know, and states know kind of what our most recent actions are. So the PFAS Council has asked for regions to begin forming a group and kind of reporting up through them, through that group and that body, to hear more directly from states and local governments and people facing the challenging issues.
Great. Well, it's good to know that you're in that role in the Southeast, including covering North Carolina. I will open it to questions. I see that Jamie is on camera, so Jamie, you can be first.
Thank you, and thank you, Aaron, for that really comprehensive presentation. The question I have, I'm not sure if you'll actually be able to answer it, and it's with respect to some of the biggest challenges that you perceive may be associated with many of the different plans that you've laid out.
As far as what's the biggest challenge?
Or what are some of the biggest challenges that you see to the implementation of many of the plans that you and your agency partners have laid out? I mean, I think they're great plans, but we all know what happens to the best laid plans. And if you can comment on some of the challenges and maybe how other federal agencies and how state agencies and how stakeholders can help you to overcome those challenges.
Well, I know we're definitely working to reinvigorate kind of that inter-federal agency partnership, because so many different agencies have equities in PFAS, whether it's, cleanup directly or, USGS with kind of looking broadly with what's out in the nation's water, or FDA as far as food packaging. There's just about every federal agency has some, tenet to PFAS. So I know that they are really looking to increase the connectivities there. That was the intent over the last 3 years to build that up, and I think it kind of stalled out. But there's a heavy push to get federal agencies talking to one another again on this, and make sure that we're, and Congress also directs us to do things under the Defense Authorization Acts. Like I had referenced, some of the actions in this presentation came from that. So we have to make sure we're not overlapping or being redundant, and that we're leveraging all the federal resources, because this is an all-encompassing effort. And so that is the challenge, is breaking down the silos, even across agencies, but also within. And that's what the roadmap and the previous action plan, attempted to do. It really was a multimedia look at our authorities and where we could go. So, not sure if I fully answered, but it is definitely a challenge.
No, I appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Aaron, when you mentioned that the MPDES program under the Office of Water Update could be used to reduce PFAS loading to waterways, how does that happen until there's standards in place? I get it, how monitoring for them could be included in permits as a look-see to find out what's there, but how does load reduction happen until standards are there adopted by states to enforce?
Right, and I think we're still very much, with the effluent limit guidelines efforts that are underway, the 9 categories, are still kind of in an information gathering and building phase, but all of that would inform the limits that you're talking about.
Okay.
So yeah, it's all forward looking, but very much a high priority to gather as much information as we can. And I think the chemical manufacturing and another one's eluding me. They're moving forward with that and still gathering information for the other 7.
All right. Yeah. So cascading down from one thing leading to another, that makes sense.
Yep.
I had a question emailed to me, and I think you might have covered it later in the presentation, but I'll just read it because there was a lot going on there. Will the analytical methods available this fall be for surface and groundwater or just for PFAS and drinking water? And I think you mentioned that there's actually going to be 8 media covered by.
Yes, it's draft method 1633, which I didn't put the full thing in my notes, so I can't pull it right out of, but I can definitely, again, drop a link in the chat. I'm not sure if this chat lives on beyond the meeting or if I
Well,
can.
we can make sure that they make it from chat to notes.
Okay.
Since it was alluded to in your presentation.
Got it. So it is draft method 1633, which is a Clean Water Act proposed method. It hasn't been through regulation yet, but again, single lab validated at this point, but it's for 40 PFAS and it's for 8 media, including biosolids, soils, water, wastewater, I think even landfill leachate, and there may be some analytical chemists on who know more than me on that one, but yeah, it's a wide ranging, that method is exciting in the number of media that we could get at for those 40 PFAS. So they're looking to multi-lab validate that one throughout this year and hopefully publish the multi-lab validated version this fall.
Thank you.
Yep.
Detlef, you have a question?
Yes, hi, Aaron. Thank you for that update. I'm curious also about, the effluent limit guidelines, and in particular, I'm wondering what role measurements like extractable organic fluorine or adsorbable organic fluorine may play to assure that we have as comprehensive of a look at, the releases, potential releases of unknown fluoroorganics, and in particular, I'm thinking about manufacturing byproducts, right? We have maybe some idea through TRI about the stuff that's being used or produced, but unknown byproducts can be a big challenge.
Right. The limit of my knowledge on where that would play into the effluent guidelines development is just that ORD is leading the effort on those methods for us, beyond the total fluorine methods, but also the non-targeted, helping us figure out how we can use those in a regulatory framework, because that's always the struggle is, when non-targeted analysis was happening, it's great information, but how you can move forward legally to pursue actions, so I know ORD's working on those methods and getting us up to speed on how we can use them. And then I think it will fall to kind of our regional science labs to develop them in a way that, we can use for enforcement purposes, for example, and ensure that the scrutiny that comes with that would stand up in a court of law. So we're not quite there on those kind of methods just yet. But I can see where you're headed, and I definitely understand the byproducts issue. We don't know what you're not looking for, because the targeted analysis is likely missing some of those.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's really important to take that more comprehensive look.
Yep, I'll definitely relay that up.
Thank
you.
Thank you, Detlef and Aaron. Other questions for Aaron? Or observations on the interaction between the EPA PFAS roadmap and the state's emerging strategy for PFAS and emerging contaminants? Thank you again, Aaron. We appreciate your preparation for and participation in today's meeting. And if you do have things that you think would be helpful for us to drop into the chat, we have about another 15 minutes on the call, so you'll have time to do that.
Awesome. I will do that. So put that in the chat window or the Q&A. Just curious.
I'm not sure that it matters.
Okay.
I guess I'll ask Dylan or Louise. They might have an answer. I don't.
Didn't want to drop it
into the chat window would be easier.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dylan. And thanks, y'all, for the opportunity.
You're welcome, and thank you again. All right, folks, with that, I'm going to move us to the last item on our agenda, which is the public forum. We have 5 people who've registered to speak. I'm going to call on them in the order with which they registered, or at least the order with which those were provided to me. We have a little over 15 minutes, I guess close to 20 minutes in our time left. I'll encourage the speakers maybe to keep your comments to around 3 minutes each, including if you want to pause for any questions for the board so that we have time to get to all 5. And I'll also remind board members, of our proactive role to be eyes and ears for the department on pollutant exposures, pollutant effects. And part of that is listening to others who have information on pollutant exposures and pollutant effects. I'll remind any of the speakers that you've got the eyes and ears of the Science Advisory Board members. We're not the regulators or the environmental managers. We do provide advice based on the robustness of science and also the limitations of science, usually in a risk-based framework. So keep that in mind in terms of the folks that you have the opportunity to communicate with. We have first on the list that I received, Emily Donovan with Clean Cape Fear. And I think procedurally, you will be given the opportunity to speak through Dylan being able to add you temporarily as a panelist. So again, if we keep it close to 3 minutes or so, might have time for a question after each one, and then that'll allow us to get to everyone. Thanks for joining us, Emily.
One moment. Let me see here.
This was Emily Donovan.
I do not see Emily Donovan in attendance.
Okay. I will, these are all folks that signed up by the deadline, and I will circle back in case there's somebody who's not on. And Emily, if you are on and we're not seeing you, you could use the chat feature to let us know. The second one that I have is Mike Waters from Grays Creek Residents United Against PFAS in Our Wells and Rivers. Mike Waters, W-A-T-T-E-R-S, Dylan.
I do not see a Waters.
Okay. I'll come back to that one at the again at the end. The next one is Dana Sargent with Cape Fear River Watch. Dana Sargent.
Yes, we do have Dana Sargent. Allow me to unmute.
Dana, the floor is yours. And thanks for joining us today.
Very much, Dr. Osberger. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I really appreciate this opportunity, and I appreciate all the presentations. I'm going to start with my primary point. First, there was a number of comments about using an MCL to inform effluent limit. And I would first say that what should be used, if anything, is actually the actual health protective MCLG. Further, it was mentioned that DEQ would have to reconcile a state MCL with a federal one. That is not the case if North Carolina sets one first. And as Dr. Knappe mentioned, EPA has a proven track record of not setting any MCLs on synthetic chemicals for decades. So North Carolina can likely beat them to it. But moreover, DEQ does not need either an MCLG or an MCL to set effluent limit technology-based effluent limit discharge. This is required under the Clean Water Act. They can get around all of the bureaucratic semantics that were presented today by immediately setting technology-based effluent limits. This authority, again, is granted under the Clean Water Act. So I really look forward to seeing some fast action from DEQ on this front. Second primary point, to DEQ, I understand, Dr. Arsberger, that we're speaking to the SAB as well, but with DEQ on the call, I want to make sure that we're speaking, that I'm using this opportunity to talk to them as a regulatory agency. I'm very concerned about Chemours' recent submission of a groundwater sampling plan for downstream counties. It was wholly inadequate and is clearly setting a narrative in an attempt to limit their liability, which is not based on facts. And I really hope DEQ is gearing up to respond as such to Chemours, and would be happy to discuss this further with DEQ. Please reach out to me. You have my contact information. Also, relative to Chemours, I would like to request that Michael Abrazinskis, appreciate your response to Dr. Canape's request, include me in your response to Dr. Canape about the sampling for tetrafluoromethane on the air emissions, including stack and thermal oxidizer and the ambient locations. As Dr. Canape shared, the ability to test for this is available, so there should be no reason why DEQ is not doing it. I also look forward to hearing from you, Mike, in response to a recent email I sent on air data more generally, and thank you. I appreciate Dr. Anejas, and I'm sorry, Anejas, I'm going to get that pronunciation wrong, question about agriculture and nitrogen. DEQ's response that they don't think there's a nitrogen problem in NC, specifically the Cape Fear Basin, which hosts the densest concentration of hogs than anywhere on the entire globe, is concerning to say the least. We know through available science that the load being sprayed on fields from industrial farming far exceeds the load that is manageable by the fields that is being applied to, and that means it's running off into our waterways. And we know the industry is now trying to push DEQ to allow them to cover their lagoons, which we know will increase the nutrient load being sprayed. The idea that one should look to TMDLs for proof that there is no issue is also concerning, considering that it takes years of bureaucracy to get an impaired listing, and this is often led by academia, folks who have pretty important day jobs in teaching our future scientists, who are then dealt, bureaucratic red tape. I'm almost done. I'm keeping it to 3 minutes. There was a comment from Dr. DeWitt that communication is key, and DEQ's response seemed to indicate that they've asked leadership about increasing their ability to communicate directly with our researchers. This is extremely concerning, considering that DEQ continues to claim that they need more data, more research before they can take action, specifically on PFAS, also on this, industrial ag. That DEQ staffers seem to think they need approval from leadership to talk to our scientific community who stands ready to share their knowledge. In closing, it's my understanding that the point of the SAB is to provide guidance to DEQ to take advantage of their expertise in order to help DEQ to follow its mission to protect human health and the environment. Many of our esteemed SAB members made it abundantly clear in this meeting and in prior meetings that there are ways that DEQ can be being more proactive. These are comments from researchers, mind you. These are folks that take science seriously, and they don't tend to jump the gun without evidence that it's time to do so. And they're clearly telling you it's time. So I really hope that you listen. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dana Sargent. Are there any, we do have time since we had 2 presentations signed up for the public forum that we may not get to. We have time for a question if there are any from the board members for Dana Sargent in response to her input on state versus federal NCLs, toxicologically based versus technology-based limits, Chemours, nitrogen in Eastern North Carolina, or science communications and engaging in policymaking. Thank you for your time, Dana. I'm sorry, it sounds like there might be one.
Yes.
Dr. Aneja, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Dana just made a comment, and I'm still somewhat unclear. She said that at least I think she said that the covered lagoon that the animal industry is going to start using will increase the nutrient loading in the environment. Can she please help me understand what she means by that?
Thank you, Dr. Anasia. And Dana, we'll let you close your talk, your participation out by answering that question, then we'll move on to the next one. But please clarify that if you would.
Sure, and I appreciate the follow-up. And I just want to point out that, yes, PFAS is my specialty. Industrial ag is my colleague Ken Burdett's specialty, and I'll be happy to send him your way for much better information. But we know through the science that phosphorus actually increases once the lagoons are covered, while they're covered. So once they uncover them and they spray that nutrient load, those nutrients on the fields, there's an increase of phosphorus added to it. And you know, the industry is trying to use this in an attempt to, you know, greenwash the public on relative to global climate change, saying that they're going to use this, you know, this waste for gas, and that's, you know, maybe the case, but at the same time they're going to be adding detriments to our water quality, and it's not going to help to prevent the issues of odor and other contaminants for the folks that live near these facilities, who are literally homes being sprayed with waste. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana and Viney. The next person who signed up for the public forum is Allison Flynn with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. So Dylan, is Allison Flynn among the participant list?
Yes, she is, and she is unmuted.
All right. Allison, thanks for joining us.
Hi, thank you, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
So I actually don't have a comment, but I did really appreciate everybody's presentation today, and looking forward to seeing where this goes. So I really appreciate it, and I'm sorry I didn't mean to sign up for a comment. So, but thank you very much.
It's quite all right. We appreciate your participation today and mentioning that. And then the last one I have, and then I'll circle back in case two of the earlier ones were missed, was Beth Marcassino with North Carolina Stop Gen X. So Dylan, it's Beth Marcassino.
I am not seeing a Beth Marcassino.
Okay. And then Emily Donovan. We'll ask one last time.
I am not seeing any Emily Donovan.
And then Mike Waters, 2 T's.
And no Michael Waters.
All right. Well, we meet every couple of months. There'll be opportunities again later for folks to sign up. I'm aware that all of you on the board, all of you at the agencies, have a lot on your plates. And I appreciate your time and attendance today, preparation for the meeting, participation in the meeting. The overview presentations of surface water, groundwater, and drinking water rules and classifications, I think, will be helpful foundational material for tailoring the board's input for the science to guide management. So I think it was a good day today. The next meeting that we have scheduled is for Monday, April 4th. And I was asked to mention, and so will say the date for the 3rd National Pfas Conference, which happens to be local. The 3rd National Pfas Conference will be held in Wilmington, North Carolina on June 15th through 17th. And there'll be, we'll make sure that that gets captured in the meeting minutes as well. Anything else from any members of the board in the last 5 or 10 minutes that we have, or from any of the agencies we serve?
Thank you, Chair, and also the board members for your help in talking through these topics. We'll continue our conversation and providing other updates between now and then.
Well, that's a good last word, Assistant Secretary Mace-Moore. With that, I'll thank everybody. I'll entertain a motion to close after I thank again Louise, Dylan, and Franny for your help in setting up the meeting, coordinating agendas, handling the IT logistics. Thanks so much. It would be appropriate for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you. And seconded by?
Second.
Detlef. Thank you. We can close the meeting out with the formalities of a vote, I think, in this case. Have a good rest of your day, everybody. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Tom. Bye.